Welcome to the Anatomy of a Cyber Attack. My name is Jason Dion, and I'm going to be your guide into the malicious mind of the cyber attacker. I'm going to show you the methodology, the tools, and techniques used in the exploitation of your networks and systems. This is going to be a great introduction to the importance of cybersecurity through both theory and hands-on examples. This course is designed for all IT personnel and provides a great overview for the need of cybersecurity through hands-on examples of network and system exploitation. This course is designed to be fun, entertaining, and engaging. We're going to use Kali Linux as our attack platform, which is a common choice among penetration testers, ethical hackers, and malicious actors. For our victim platforms, we're going to use Windows and Linux systems, allowing us to understand the vulnerabilities of both of these operating environments. In order to keep our lab environment secure from the internet and the internet secure from us, we're going to use VirtualBox, a free virtualization software, in order to build our lab and keep all of the virtual machines in an isolated virtual network. We're going to cover a lot of ground throughout the course. For many, this will be your first exposure to the world of cybersecurity. For others, this may simply be a continuation of your previous IT experience. Regardless, I know everyone is going to learn something from this course as we dissect the threat in the anatomy of a cyber attack. Creating our lab environment, or our own special little place to hack. What we're going to do here is we're going to actually download a program called VirtualBox. We're going to go to virtualbox.org and we're going to download the latest version. VirtualBox is a virtualization software. It allows us to put multiple pieces of operating systems on a single piece of physical hardware. Now, some people ask, why do we use virtual machines? Well, one of the reasons we're going to use virtual machines in this environment is because we want to make sure that we're not doing any attacking or cracking on a live network. The way laws work, in the United States, hacking is considered illegal, as well as many other countries. Now, if you own the network or you have permission of the network owner in writing, you can then hack those networks legally. In this case, since we're building our own network, we'll have the legal rights to hack that network, and therefore we don't have the police knocking at our door. So for my penetration testing lab, I actually use a MacBook Pro. This allows me to have something that's portable that I can carry with me when I go teach classes, but it also has enough power to do what I'm going to want to do. It'll allow me to run 4, 5, or 6 different operating systems at once. We can run things like Windows, Linux, Unix, or even Mac OS X on top of these virtual machines. First thing we're going to do is we're going to go to virtualbox.org. At virtualbox.org, we're going to download the latest version. As of today, that's version 5.1. Once you click on the download button, you'll see where the operating systems are listed. If you have Windows, click on that. I have Mac, so I'm going to choose OS X, and if you have Linux, click on that one. Now, at some points during this video and other videos in this course, you're going to notice that time sort of fast forwards on you. The reason is I don't want you to have to sit there and wait while my system downloads or my system processes something. So I'm going to compress those by going 2 or 3 or 4 times as fast. If you find that your system hasn't caught up to that, that's fine. Just hit pause, wait for your system to catch up, and then you can restart the video at that point. Once you've downloaded the installer, you're going to go ahead and run through the installation program. It's as simple as hitting continue and install as we work our way through it. Now at the end of the installation, it's asking if you want to remove the installation file, which is fine because you don't need the installer anymore. You've already installed it to your system. So now that we have VirtualBox installed as our virtual sandbox for our hacking efforts, we need to move on to the installation of an attack platform. In our case, that's going to be Kali Linux. We're going to get started with building our hacking lab. Now we've already installed VirtualBox, but now we need to install some attack and victim platforms. For our attack platform, we're going to use Kali Linux. So first we're going to open up our web browser, and we're going to go to kali.org, Kali.org. Once we get to Kali, we're going to go to the downloads link, and we're going to click on the 32-bit ISO. The reason I'm choosing the 32-bit is because that'll work on both 32 and 64-bit systems. Kali Linux is a distribution that's created by Offensive Security, and it has a lot of the tools that we're going to use throughout this course, and there's hundreds and hundreds of tools packed into Kali Linux, so it's a really good ethical hacking platform. Now that it's finished downloading, we're going to close our web browser, and we'll go to our downloads. You can see here I have Kali 2016.2 i386. That's going to be the ISO file we're going to use. Now we're going to open up our VirtualBox. Once it's open, we're going to click on New to create a new virtual machine. The type of machine we're going to create is a Kali Linux box. So I'm going to type Kali for the name, select Linux as the type, and we're using 32-bit Debian for our operating system, which is what Kali is based on. Next we'll hit continue. We're going to give it 2 gigabytes of memory, which is 2048 megabytes, and we're not going to add a hard disk. It's going to give us a warning about this. We'll just tell it to continue. Now we have a basic machine set up, but we have a couple of changes we want to make. The first one is we want to click on System, and I want to go to Processor, and I want to enable PAE. The next one is I want to go to Storage, and I want to select the empty CD-ROM disk. In this case, I'm going to choose my virtual disk, go to my Downloads folder, and select Kali Linux. And then hit OK. Everything will be set up for us to use Kali as a live distribution off of the DVD-ROM. Hit Start. Enter the live distribution. Now if we want to fill the screen, we'll go up to View at the top and go to full screen mode, which is Host key F. On a Mac, that is your Command key. It'll give you a warning. And now we have a working, functional Kali Linux machine. Now when Kali is in full screen, if you want to go back to your other environment, on Macintosh you'll hit Command Tab, and on Windows you'll hit Alt Tab, and you can cycle through your windows just like that. In our next lesson, we're going to start installing some victim platforms. So now that we have our attack platform set up, we need to install some victims. I'm going to start by installing a Microsoft Windows platform. So what I'm going to do is click New, just like we did with Kali, give it a name. In my case, I'm going to call it Windows XP. Now I understand that Windows XP is a very old operating system, but the reason I use it is because it uses very little resources, and there's plenty of vulnerabilities for us to attack against. So for those who have a weak laptop, you can still run VirtualBox, Kali, and Windows XP on it and do just fine. So in this case, I'm going to hit Continue. I'm going to give it half a gigabyte, which is 512 megabytes. I'm going to create a 10 gigabyte hard disk, which is plenty of room for a Windows XP installation. And then we'll create a dynamically allocated disk, which means it won't use all the space until Windows needs it. We'll hit Continue. Now we're going to have to install the CD-ROM. So I'm going to click on Optical Drive, choose my image, and select my Windows XP CD, and click Open. Now if you don't have a Windows XP CD, you can get one on eBay, Amazon, Newegg, or any of the hundreds of other websites out there. They're very cheap, they're very old, and most of us have one just laying around someplace. At this point we'll start. This begins the boot process for Windows XP, and you'll see it's going to go through our standard Windows setup. I'll create this full screen. At this point we're going to hit Enter to set up a new installation. F8 to agree to the license and terms. Then we're going to hit C to create a partition. We'll hit Enter to use the entire disk, which was the 10 gigabytes we made, that virtual partition, and Enter again to install onto that new C drive. We'll format it quickly using NTFS. And now it will copy of our files. This will usually only take about 3 to 5 minutes on most systems because XP installs very quickly because it's such a small operating system. Once the files have copied, it will ask you to restart. We'll hit Enter, and the virtual machine will restart. At this point we'll get into the graphical setup of the Windows installation. Next we're going to select the regional and language options. In this case I'm going to accept the defaults of the United States. We're going to give it a name. In my case I'm going to use the name of John Sim. And his organization is going to be Sim Incorporated. We're going to give his computer a name. I'm going to call it John PC. And then we'll give it an admin password. In my case I'm going to use the traditional favorite of password. Password, and confirm with password. We'll check the date and times. In my case I'm on the East Coast, and we'll use the typical settings for the network. And we'll use a workgroup environment. And once that's done, it will reboot. We'll go through the setup. we could tell it to not do the updates because we're not going to be connected to the internet. We'll skip the registration and say not at this time. Again, I'm going to use John Sim as my user and then say finish. The last thing we want to do is we want to go ahead and change our network settings. So we'll click on Network. We're going to take our network adapter, and right now we're going to put it on internal network, and we'll just call that iNet and hit OK. At this point we have one attack platform, which is Kali, and one victim, which is Windows XP. But we also want to put a Linux machine in here for a victim. So we're going to go ahead and open up our web browser, and we're going to go to Google and we're going to search for a program called Metasploitable. And Metasploitable is a downloadable operating system. It is a virtual machine created around Linux that is actually made for testing and security tool practice because it has a bunch of vulnerabilities in there for us to exploit. So it's going to be a great learning environment for us. So we'll go ahead and click on the SourceForge link, and then we will download it, which comes as a zip file. Now, once Metasploitable is downloaded, it comes as a zip file. We'll have to unzip it. On a Mac environment, you'll just double-click it. In Windows, you'll right-click and extract it. If you open the folder, you'll see that this comes as a VMX file, with the hard drive being a VMDK. That's because this comes as part of VMware file format, but that's okay. VirtualBox will still be able to use that. So what we'll do is we'll go into VirtualBox, we'll click New. In this case, we'll give the name of Metasploitable. It's a Linux, and it is considered other Linux. Then we'll hit Continue. 256 megabytes is plenty of space for Metasploitable. And for the hard drive, we're going to click Use an existing hard drive, and then we're going to go to that download folder and select the VMDK file. Hit Create. Now the last two things we have to do is go to System, go to Processor, and again enable that PAE-NX, which will allow this Linux distro to work, and then click on Network and go to Internal Network because we don't want this touching the outside world, so we'll keep it on our internal network, and hit OK. At this point we should be able to power it on with no issues. And again, if you want to go full screen, View Full Screen. And now we have Metasploitable. Now the login is msfadmin with the password of msfadmin. We could try that to ensure that it works. And now we have a usable Metasploitable that's up and running for us to start hacking against. Again, I'm going to do the Alt tab or Command tab to get back to the Macintosh environment. So now I have my Metasploitable and my Kali Linux running. I can also start my Windows XP, and I want to ensure that all of my networks are set to that internal network. So as you can see, I've set all of mine to internal network. You want to do the exact same thing, just clicking on Network and selecting internal network, and the name of the network has to be matching on all three of them. The CIA triad, and we're not talking about intelligence. So when we talk about the CIA triad in cybersecurity, we're talking about confidentiality, integrity, and availability. These three things make up the core of defense of our networks. If we can guarantee the confidentiality, integrity, and security of our networks, we will have a secure network for us to operate in. Now, as a hacker, what we always focus on is how we can breach the confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So what is confidentiality? Well, confidentiality answers the question of how secure is the information and how secure does it need to be. So if we have information like our social security number or our date of birth, that's information that we want to keep private because we don't want attackers to get that information. Conversely, if we look at something like my personal website, I want people to be able to see that, and so I have that out there without confidentiality attached to it. So it's not that you always need confidentiality or you don't need confidentiality, it really depends on your use case. So what are some good ways to protect your confidentiality? Well, some ways that we do this are physical things. For instance, if I have a file that I want to keep confidential, I might put it in a safe and lock it up. If I have information I want to keep confidential, I might use that as encryption, and I'll scramble up that data and save it in a different format so that people can't read that information. These are two ways that we can use confidentiality, and as an attacker, we look for the weakest part of the confidentiality train so that we can break into it and get the information that we want. So what is a failure of confidentiality? Well, simply put, if someone can read the information that you've tried to hide, that is going to be a breach of confidentiality. The second part of the CIA triad is integrity. And integrity is all about, has the data been changed? So the way that we actually keep track of whether data has been changed generally is by the use of something called a hash. And we create this checksum that actually looks at the data and creates a unique fingerprint of that data, so we'll know if it's been changed. If you change even a single bit inside that data stream, the hash will become vastly different. To ensure we have integrity, it means that the data has not been changed in retrieval, in storage, or in transit. If we can do that, we can ensure that we have good integrity of our data. A failure of integrity is what happens when we have data that gets changed. So, for instance, if you look at your account balance and you have $1,000 and I change that to be $10, that would be a failure of integrity. The third part of the security triad is availability. And availability really focuses on, is the data available to be retrieved when you want it to be retrieved? So, if a server is up, that's good. If the server is down, it has no availability. The way that we can get availability is that we can have redundancy in our networks. So if I have two servers performing the function of one, if one went down, the second one would take the load. There would still be good availability. One of the most important things in availability is having good backups and good disaster recovery. For example, if I'm an attacker and I go after a server with a denial of service attack and I take down the server, can the company restore to another server in a very short amount of time? If they can keep their availability up and keep their customers happy. But if they can't, then I can actually take this network offline by doing my denial of service. Their availability does suffer. So the last thing we want to talk about when we talk about our CIA triad is that it's not actually a perfect triangle. So really what comes down to is each of these things are important, but they're always important in different amounts depending on your use case scenario. Sometimes you'll have people who try to get this perfect balance of all three, and honestly that just doesn't happen most of the time. Let's look at a couple of examples. So, in this example, I have a high confidentiality, high integrity, low availability. Now, what would be a good example of that? Well, let's say I have something that's really, really secret and really, really important and I don't want it to be changed. Like, let's say I have some top secret plans for the new Death Star. I wouldn't want the rebels to get a hold of that, so therefore I'm going to take that and I'm going to encrypt that data, giving confidentiality. I'm going to do hash checking so that if somebody makes a change in the plans, I'd be able to detect that. But I might lock that inside a safe and put that safe inside of a locked room and that room inside of a locked building, and so it's really hard to get to. So my availability might be low, but I'll have very good confidentiality and very good integrity. That's really important if you have important data that needs to be kept safe. Another way to look at this is where we have low confidentiality but high integrity and high availability. A good example of that would be a website. For example, if you go to my website, I want you to be able to see the images and the text that I put up there, meaning that it has good integrity, that it hasn't been changed. But I also want it to be highly available. I want anyone to be able to get to it. There's no usernames needed, there's no passwords needed, because I just want you to be able to view it. So in this case, I have very low confidentiality, but high integrity and high availability. So the last thing we want to talk about is this trade-off that occurs. We have this trade-off that happens between operations and security, and it always happens. If you look in your workplace environment, you will want to have high operations because you want to be productive and make a lot of money in your company. But you also want good security. And the problem is, as you increase security, often the operations end up suffering. And the reason for that is there's always this trade-off. For example, if I require everyone to log in with a username and a password and a token, that's a little bit harder on operations, so it slows them down, but it gives me much better security. Conversely, if I let everyone just log onto the computer with a shared account that everybody has the same username and password, I have zero security, but it's very quick and efficient to do. So there's always going to be this trade-off, and we have to consider that when we build our systems. Now, as an attacker, we're always going to be looking at where are those places that operations has taken over and security has lapsed. For example, if 5 people are using the same username and password, I can go after any one of those 5 people using social engineering attacks and be able to get that username or password, and now I can break that system. Hackers, crackers, and attackers. Oh my! In this lesson, we're going to start thinking like an attacker by starting to understand what are some of their different motivations. So hackers have a very unique definition that's evolved over time. Originally, hackers were just computer enthusiasts. It's people who enjoyed computers and tried to learn what made them operate, and they would tinker with them and take them apart and try to go through the operating system and understand it in depth. Now, over time, especially in the mid-'80s and the late '80s, we started seeing a lot of computer hackers becoming a negative connotation. You'd see this pop up in movies and TV and newspapers. And because of that, there's actually a separate term that came out called an ethical hacker. And ethical hackers are people who are hired by a company that use the skills that they learn of hacking and taking apart a computer to do security and penetration testing for those networks. Because of that, the term crackers evolved, and that meant a criminal hacker, someone who is doing this hacking for a bad or malicious reason. This is the people you usually think of when you think about a movie or a television show where you have this malicious actor breaking into computers and trying to steal all the information. So hackers in general wear one of three hats. They can be either white hats, black hats, or gray hats. So a white hat is your ethical hacker. He's breaking into computer systems with permission of the network owner, and the reason why they do that is just to increase the security of the network. Now on the other side we have the black hats. The black hats are the malicious actors. They're the criminals, they're the ones who are breaking without permission, they're trying to steal your information, and they're trying to break your systems. Now in the middle of that we have what's called a gray hat. And a gray hat is sometimes good and sometimes bad. It's kind of a gray area, if you will. One of the things that you'll see with a gray hat, for instance, is somebody who does bug bounties. They might be searching software to find the hidden vulnerabilities known as bugs. Now if they turn those into the company, that would be a white hat action. If they used it for a malicious intent to steal information, that would be a black hat. Well, what would you say if they found that information and immediately posted it to the internet for everybody to know? Well, we would consider that a gray action because they didn't give the company time to fix the problem, and so now good guys and bad guys have access to the information at the same time. That becomes a gray action. It's not good, it's not bad, it's kind of somewhere in the middle. Sometimes they play nice, sometimes they don't. And this is a really difficult group of people to work with because sometimes they're really helpful and sometimes they're really not. So some other types of attackers that we want to mention here is we're going to start with phreakers. Now phreakers are really focused on telephones and PBX systems, and the most famous of them was a gentleman known as Captain Crunch. Now the reason why he was known as Captain Crunch is because back in the 70s when you used to pay for long distance at a payphone, you'd put in a series of coins and you'd hear a beep, and there would be a whistling sound essentially that would tell the telephone company that you've paid enough money to make that long distance call. Well, this gentleman found a whistle in the Captain Crunch cereal box that made the right frequency, which is 2600 hertz, and if he blew it, it would give you free long distance. So again, it's just learning that system and being able to figure out what those security bugs are. In this case, they're doing it for malicious reasons because they want to get free long distance. But that's what a phreaker is. They're all about telephones and PBX systems. So two other types that we have here are software crackers and hackers and system crackers and hackers. So a software cracker and hacker is looking at how to disable registration keys and essentially get software for free. This was really popular with the old Microsoft Windows. People would pirate and steal the Microsoft Windows operating system, but it required that long 25-character password to be able to use the software. And so they would find ways to break that registration system so they can get free access to the software. Now system hackers and crackers, they're all about figuring out what are the bugs in the operating system that they can exploit. So for instance, I might specialize in Windows hacking or Linux hacking or Cisco iOS hacking if I wanted to go after network routers and switches. Another type of attacker is what's called a suicide hacker. Now these are people that know that they may get caught and they may go to jail for what they're doing, but they don't care and they're going to do it anyway. That's why we call them a suicide hacker. It's a lot like a suicide bomber in the terrorist world. The one at the bottom of the screen here is really important to understand, especially from a cybersecurity perspective, and that's your disgruntled employees and your insider threat. Now, why is that so important? Well, these people may not be technically savvy. They may just be your receptionist or your sales clerk. But if they have a beef with you, they can use their privilege, their authorized user access that they already have, their usernames and passwords, to get on your system and take information with them. Probably the most famous example of this is Edward Snowden with the NSA. But there's tons of examples throughout history of insider threats where they steal your information and they either sell it for gain or put it out in the public domain. Another type of attacker that we have is what we call script kiddies. Now script kiddies think they're hackers, but really what they do is they download other people's tools. So they might go onto a website, download a tool like for instance the Ion Cannon that was very popular with hacktivists for a while. And you would essentially just download this piece of software, plug in a website name, hit go, and it would start doing a denial of service attack. There was no skill involved, there was no coding of their own tools, it was just taking tools that were readily available. Now a lot of the ethical hacker tools that are out there are freely available in open source. And so a lot of script kiddies will take those tools and use those as a way to hack into networks. But again, there's no level of skill in this. It's just very, very primitive. They grab the tool and they go. Now the problem is there's a lot more of these tools available than there used to be. And so as these tools keep increasing in number, we start seeing a lot more script kiddies in action. Another type of hacker we have is the cyber terrorist, cyber criminals, or hacktivists. Now, cyber terrorists and cyber criminals and hacktivists are a group that kind of get lumped in together a lot. So if you start thinking of things like LulzSec and Anonymous, these are hacker groups, and some of them are very skilled and some of them are very unskilled. It depends on who is in this group. They're very loosely affiliated, and they all try to serve a common purpose. With hacktivism, you're doing it as a political motivation. With cyber criminals, it's usually a money motivation. And with cyber terrorists, it's usually an ideological motivation. And finally, we have the good guys, the ethical hackers. These are folks who are hired by a firm to come in and test those networks. They have permission, they don't want to harm the networks, and anything they do is reversible. So anything that they do in their hacking and penetration testing, they then create a report and give that to the organization so that the organization can get better and do a better job of securing their networks. Hacker's methodology, a malicious mindset. In this lecture, we're going to talk about the different steps of the hacking methodology. There's 6 steps to the hacker's methodology. We're going to perform reconnaissance, scan and enumerate the network, gain our access, maintain our access, and then we're going to place backdoors and cover our tracks on our way out. These are the 6 steps that every hacking evolution tends to go through. We're going to cover each of them in detail further, and then we'll show you tools and techniques to use those. But in this lecture, we're just going to talk about a brief overview. The first step is performing reconnaissance. So in this case, we're going to do everything passively. We don't want to touch the victim network yet. Here we're going to be looking at open source sites in the internet. So we're going to be scanning for things like understanding what their networks look like, from their network ranges, their IP addresses. We might be able to find things like ports and protocols. We might find victim email addresses to launch a spear phishing campaign against. We're going to find out who owns their domain. We might find pattern of life on different employees. This is where we start looking and spend a lot of our time. Most hacking evolutions take about 80% of the hacker's methodology is spent in this phase. Everything we do here is very passive, and we're going to be looking at everything from an arm's reach. We don't want them to know who we are and where we're coming from yet. Some of the techniques we use are things like dumpster diving, internet harvesting, domain information gathering. We'll be receiving any emails we can find. We'll be checking social media and establishing those patterns of life. The second step is where we start getting active. It's called scanning and enumeration. So here's where we might be doing things like port scanning, actually reaching out and touching the network, finding out what ports are open and what services are on those ports. We'll do our enumeration where we can start figuring out, are they using Windows or Linux or Mac? We'll figure out what versions they're running. If they're running a web server, are they running Apache? Are they running IIS? These are all the things we're going to find out during our scanning and enumeration phase that's going to help us build our attack before we ever get into stage 3. In our third step, we're doing our exploitation and we're gaining access. At this point, we're going to actually launch our attack. So we've spent probably 80 to 90% of our time between phases 1 and phase 2 at this point, and now we're in our third phase, and our third phase is where we're actually launch this attack. This is where we might actually throw an exploit, conduct a social engineering campaign, something where we're being very active, and now our risk level has gone up because there's a possibility that the organization we're going after can see us and see what we're doing. At this point, we're either doing client-side or remote exploitation. This can be things like social engineering, launching exploits, sending out malicious code that attacks a bug or a vulnerability. We could be putting out viruses or Trojans, all the different ways that we can go about it. And we'll go through some of those in this course. The fourth phase is we're going to do our escalation of privileges. So now that we've launched our exploit, we've gained our initial access. Usually we're going to gain access as a user. So for instance, if I do a spear phishing campaign and one of the users clicks it, it's most likely going to be someone in the generic pool, not a system administrator. So at this point I want to be able to get system admin rights. At this point, I'm going to have to do something to get from a user level to a system or root level or a domain administrator. And I'm going to always go for the highest privilege that I can get. The way I'll do this is I'll use various exploits and bugs in the operating system, and we'll use those vulnerabilities to our own advantage. For a Windows environment, the golden ticket that we're looking for here is the domain admin. Now once I've got those administrative rights, I move into phase 5, which is maintaining my access. Just because I have one user account doesn't mean that I'm going to be able to stay in there, because if the system administrators realize that I'm the bad guy, they can just delete that account and then I've lost my access. So instead, once I get access, I'm going to go and create several user accounts and I'm going to hide myself throughout the system. That way I can gain that persistent access where I can always get back to that network anytime I want. Some of the techniques I'll use here is I'll put network sniffers in there or keyloggers so I can gain additional usernames and passwords. If I'm a domain admin at this point, I can create my own usernames and passwords and create new accounts. Of course, it's better to steal somebody else's because then it's easier to blend in because it's a legitimate user. And again, our goal here is to maintain persistent access. That might include punching some holes in the firewall so that we have ports that are open and listening for our return when we want to come back. Finally, the last thing we're going to do in phase 6 is we're going to hide ourselves and we're going to cover our tracks. So at this point we've created some additional accounts. Now we're going to put some backdoors in and we're going to start going through and clearing out those log files. If there's information we want to steal, this is the point where we're going to start exploiting that information and start downloading it and exfiltrating it. At this point we might install a rootkit or a backdoor, and this way I can always get back, and that again maintains that persistence like I was doing in phase 5, but for the long term. A lot of hackers and attackers at this point have their fingers in a lot of different networks, and they don't always go in and steal everything right away. They might go in, lay the groundwork, and then sit dormant for a while, and then they'll take the information they want, or use that network for some other nefarious purpose. And so as you can see, as we've moved through these 6 phases in the operation, we went from the passive collection and reconnaissance, then we started getting more and more active, and as we actually get onto the box in stage 3 and 4 and 5 and 6, that's where our risk level goes up, because if I'm on the box, there's a chance that I can get caught by the system administrator. So I have to be very careful in where I go and what I do so I don't set off any alarms and trigger any alerts, because I don't want to get caught. I want to be very quiet and very sneaky as I go in and take the information that I want and meet my intended purpose. Ethical hackers. Isn't that an oxymoron? So we talked a little bit about all the different attackers and the hackers' methodology at this point. So now we want to talk about the good guys, the ethical hackers, for a moment. They do a lot of the same things, and in fact sometimes they even use some of the same tools. So when we look at their methodology, it's going to look very similar. The big difference is we have a step at the beginning and a step at the end for ethical hackers. So ethical hackers follow a similar methodology, but there's a couple of key differences. One is they get permission. The second is everything they do is reversible. They're not trying to do harm to the network. The goal here is to look at the organization and identify the weaknesses, not to hurt the organization. So when we look at the hackers methodology, we had 6 steps. Now when we put on the ethical hackers methodology, we're going to add a step at the beginning and a step at the end. The first step we're going to add is approval. We're going to get permission before we do anything. Now, the reason why this is really important is, again, we've talked about this before, but hacking is illegal. You cannot hack anybody's networks. You have to have written permission from the network owner or own the network yourself. So an ethical hacker will always have a written document, and we like to affectionately call this the get out of jail free letter. Ethical hackers are employed or contracted by the organizations they hack. They are brought in and they are asked to hack those networks. You have to have that letter in writing to make sure you don't get in trouble. Remember, hacking is a felony in the United States, so you have to make sure you have that get out of jail free letter. And I can't stress this enough, always, always, always have it in writing. The writing should tell you exactly what it is you're allowed to hack and what the scope is. For instance, if I'm going after Microsoft, maybe they only want me to go after their Hotmail servers. They don't want me to go after everything. That would be in that get out of jail free letter. Same thing with any organization you go after. You have to have it very clearly scoped so you know what is and what is not in bounds for the assessment. So after we get permission, we go through the 6 standard steps of the hacker's methodology. So the last step and most important step is reporting. Reporting is going to be that list of all the things that you found during your penetration testing. You're going to document things like how you got in, what the weaknesses were, and how you recommend that they fix them. One of the most important things you should do is provide a prioritized list. So just because you found 15 or 20 different ways of getting in, you need to tell them that this is the most important way. Fix this first because this is a vulnerability I found on 200 of your machines, whereas the other one I might have only found it on 1. Now, they're going to want to fix everything eventually, but it helps them when they're trying to figure out where should they spend their money quickest and first to get the most bang for their buck. And remember, your report should be clear, concise, and most importantly, be useful. The reconnaissance phase. I can see you, but you can't see me. So as we look at the hacker's methodology, you'll remember that the first step we have is reconnaissance, and we talked about the fact that we spend about 80 to 90% of our time in this phase before we actually begin our exploitation. During phase 1, we're going to perform reconnaissance. This is our systematic attempt to locate, gather, identify, and record information about our target. This is also known as footprinting, and this is a passive collection technique. We'll do things like using open source research and internet searches like Google. We'll use social engineering, dumpster diving, and email harvesting to collect as much information as we can about the organization before we start targeting the organization for an actual exploit. So what types of information are we desiring? Well, we're going to gather any information we can, but the things we're really focused on are things like phone numbers, contact names, email addresses, security-related information, information systems that are being utilized, things like if we know if they're using Windows or Linux, job postings, and resumes. So job postings and resumes may seem like an odd thing to collect, but the reason why we collect job postings is there's a lot of information that we'll find there. For instance, if I was going after this company, Technical Innovations, I look at some of their job postings. In this one, there's a system administrator job. and I start looking at the knowledge and skills and abilities. They're looking for somebody who has 2000 or 2003 Microsoft certifications. That tells me they're probably running Windows Server 2000 or Windows Server 2003, opening up a whole world of exploits to me. They're using Unix or Linux and HP Blade systems. Again, that's information that we can find useful as we go through our exploitation. Further down, we see again, there's Windows servers. They keep popping up, Windows workstations, Windows servers. That's going to help me start mapping out what that network might look like so I can start figuring out what kind of attacks I want to generate. And finally, they mentioned shift work is required. Now, what does that tell me as an attacker? Well, if shift work is required, that means that there's people in the building most likely 24 hours a day. So if I was going to try to break in from a physical standpoint, doing it in the overnight hours may not be as effective as I thought it might be. Because they're doing shift work, there's people there, people can therefore catch me. I want to be more careful when I do that, and I'll have to start developing that pattern of life a little bit better so I'll know when the shift changes happen and when people are or are not at work. Some shifts only work 2 shifts, in which case they might work 16 hours of the day, leaving 8 hours exposed. Others work shift work where it's 24-hour coverage. These are the things we're going to have to figure out by looking at that pattern of life before we start an exploit. Because one of the exploits we can do is actually doing physical break-ins if that's within the scope of our assessment. So the second thing we're going to look at here is resumes. Now, resumes may be helpful. There's a couple of reasons. One is if I'm searching for the name of a company and I pull up somebody's resume, I may find an employee who used to work there who may not be happy with their job. I can find out information from them. Secondly, I can look at the type of skills of the people that they've hired before. So while I look at this professional summary and the technical proficiencies, that's interesting but not necessarily too helpful. But when I get to the second page of his resume, I can see that he has his professional experience and educational and training. In this case, I can see that ABC Energy Company that he worked at hired him as a Linux system administrator. He had over 200 Linux systems. He had Red Hat and SUSE Linux. That's going to help me narrow down my scope of exploitation. Additionally, they use VMware. So that tells me that they're using virtualized environments. So even if I break into a single box, I'm going to have to find a way to break out of that box and into the other boxes. That can be difficult. So these are things I want to start looking at. Additionally, he did a migration effort of Windows servers over to Red Hat version 4. Now I know the exact version that they were running, at least during the time he was there. And as you can see in the resume, he is presently employed there. So that would tell me something else. He also has incorporated that into a 2003 Windows Server Active Directory domain. So again, as I'm attacking, I go, oh, he's got Windows Server 2003. Let me look at exploits that can break those vulnerabilities. The next thing I see is that he's using Citrix Metaframe. So with Citrix, that's another client that we would be using, and we can start targeting vulnerabilities against Citrix if we couldn't get in through Windows or Linux. Lots of different options as I go through this guy's resume and figure out where those vulnerabilities are for this organization. So what are some tools we use in Reconnaissance? Well, there's lots of tools that exist. We can use things like NSLookup, traceroute, ping, whois, domain dossier, email dossier, Google, social networking, Discover, and Maltego, just to name a few. I'm going to briefly talk about each of these as we keep going, and in our labs we're going to actually play with a couple of these tools as we do a mock reconnaissance phase. The first one we're going to talk about is NSLookup. Now NSLookup stands for Name Server Lookup, and it resolves a fully qualified domain name to an IP address. For example, if you have my website name, jasondion.com, computers don't understand that. They understand numbers. So if I did an NSLookup of jasondion.com, I'll get back the IP address of my server, in this case 205.172.19.193. This is what we call non-interactive mode. I give it the command and I give it the website and it will give me the information back. There's also an interactive mode. In interactive mode, you just type NSLookup and then hit enter. This brings you up into the interactive mode. At this point, you can set certain types and modifiers. For example, on the screen here you see I set type to MX. That stands for mail records. By doing this, I can search for the mail records associated with youtube.com. As you see there, I got those mail exchangers displayed to the screen. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of different options for NSLookup. And if you want to learn more about it, I'd recommend going and searching NSLookup on the web. You'll get all the details you'll need. For the ethical hacker exam, you will have to know several of these modifiers. For our reconnaissance efforts, because we're going to be limited in scope in our reconnaissance, because we're using a virtualized lab, you won't need to know these in depth. Now another thing I want to mention here is when you do NSLookup, you're actually doing a lookup from your attack platform, in our case Kali Linux, to a DNS server to get that information. If you want to do this anonymously, there's lots of good tools out on the web. One of my favorites is centralops.net. We'll play with that during our labs as well, and this will help us remain passive longer during our reconnaissance phase. So if we use centralops.net, here's an example of what that would look like. You fill in the blanks in the web page, you hit go, and on the right side you'll see our answers came back. You can see that for jasondion.com I was able to find the A record, which is its address, their IP address. I also found its name servers, which could help me if I'm going to do a DNS attack, and I found its mail servers as well. The next tool we're going to talk about is traceroute. And traceroute displays the path between your device, our Kali workstation, and the destination IP address, showing each router hop along the way. So every time I find a router or a firewall, it's going to display that route. For instance, if you do traceroute and the IP address, you'll get those routes in between. If you do traceroute and the domain name, such as google.com, you'll be able to see all the routers and firewalls between your computer and google.com. So the way traceroute works is it's going to increase your time to live for every time you send out a packet. So it's going to send out 3 packets with a time to live of 1. It'll go 1 hop and then fail and send back an error message. Then it will send out the next 3 packets with a time to live of 2. They'll go 2 hops and report back with an error message, and it will keep doing this until it reaches the destination. This allows it to know exactly how many hops it takes, how long each hop takes to get there, and which route it took through the network. Each time a packet passed through a host, a router, or a firewall, it will decrease the time to live by 1 and forward the packet on. When that reaches a time to live of 0, it will actually produce a type 11 error, and that packet will be sent back to the sender. Now as it does this and it goes through all of the hops, it's collecting all of this data back with the time to live, and it'll combine that into the report for you to see. 3 timestamp values are returned for each host along the path, and this is actually the delay and the latency it takes. So you can actually determine how long it took to get from my computer all the way to Google and the particular route it took. Now, what does latency tell you? It can tell you what kind of connection the people have. So for instance, if they have a dial-up modem, I know this is really old, but some places still do, you'll have a longer latency, 100 to 150 milliseconds. If you have cellular, it's somewhere around 50 to 150 milliseconds. If you're using satellite, you'll have a very high latency, around 600 to 700 milliseconds. If you're using fiber optic, it'll be very low latency, 5 to 40 milliseconds. So you'll be able to tell that as you're doing this traceroute, and it can start giving you some more information about the victim you're going after. And here's just an example of what a traceroute output looks like. So for instance, here you see traceroute jasondion.com. You'll see the first gateway, 10.0.2.2. You'll see a couple of series of stars. That's usually a firewall that's not reporting back, but it knows there's something there. And then it continues on through all of the routers, in this case starting at hawaii.rr.com and going all the way down to unifiedlayer.com, which is my hosting provider. Again, going back to centralops.net, they have great tools for us. We can do the same traceroute there, and again that keeps us at that arm's reach. We're not actually touching the server we're going to. We're doing it from centralops server to the victim, not from our computer to the victim in this case. Next we're going to talk about ping. And ping is actually used to check the IP connectivity between 2 network devices. And we often use this in network troubleshooting, but we can also use it in our hacking efforts. So with Linux, ping is actually going to go until it's terminated. When you use it on Windows, it only does a count of 4. So we can do ping and the domain name or ping and the IP address, and it will start telling us, is that distant end up? We use this often in what's called a ping sweep, where we'll start pinging an entire range of networks to find out who is up and who is down in that range of IP addresses. Here's an example where I'm pinging again my server, jasondion.com. I did it for a count of 6, and you'll see that it responded. It sent out 64 bytes each time. It responded back with the IP address, and the time to live decreased by 1, and the time of how long it took, in this case, about 99 milliseconds. And once again, we can go back to central ops and do this from an arm's length distance. We can do it the same way. We'll tell the domain we want to go to or the IP address, how long to wait for a timeout, how many hops is too many, how many packets to send, and the data size. It'll do that information and pop back the display as you see on the right of your screen. The next tool we have is what's called Whois. And what Whois does is it provides us information on the domain name owner. So we can get things like the server address, the owner's name, their physical address, their phone numbers, and how to contact them. Why might this be helpful to us? We can use this to develop a successful social engineering attack against them. For example, if we know who their web hosting provider is, we can craft an email to the owner of the domain that says, your website domain is going to expire. Click here to renew. And if they click there, we can use that as a way to get into their networks. So here's just a simple whois command, whois, jasondion.com, and up it pops with the information. It tells me the name servers and some basic information such as when it does expire. If I want to get more details, I would go to internic.net and I could put in the domain name there, or again, we can go to Central Ops. And Central Ops has what's called a domain dossier. Domain dossier will actually give us the whois record for the domain and the network, the DNS records like we talked about before, the trace route, which we've talked about before, and the addition of a service scan. We can run all of these from Central Op Server, keeping us more anonymous. There's also another function there called the email dossier. And the email dossier is actually going to provide us those mail records we looked at before. It'll do email address validation for us. And we can get the IP and server addresses for those emails, as well as an SMTP connection log. So in this example, I have titancipher@gmail.com. This is an email I use with a lot of hacking competitions for my students. If you notice here, we can go in there, click go, and we'll see what we get. In this case, we see that it has a confidence rating of 3, which says that this passed a validation of the email. It is a real email address. We could see the MX records, and then on the right side you'll see the SMTP session, where the server from Central Ops actually talked to Google server to validate that that was a good email address. And you can see the commands that were run there. Another wonderful resource we have is Google. Now I know this seems like it's obvious, but there's a lot of information on the internet that's just open source. We can use Google to search press releases, corporate websites, and everything else at once, and the way you craft your commands in Google can really help you become more efficient as you search for this information. There have been numerous books written about Google hacking, including adding things like the file types or adding or subtracting keywords, using pluses and minuses, and operators and or operators. There's lots of ways to do what we call Google hacking and just getting a really good, well-crafted search so that you can find the information you want quickly. What can we find through Google? Well, let's get an example of a PowerPoint file or an Excel file. I can search for that company name and a file type of XLS. That'll pop back every spreadsheet that it can find in Google. I can take one of those, embed malware, and send it out to an employee as part of a spear phishing campaign. It's going to look legitimate because it was a real file from the company and it has real information from the company, but I gave them just a little something extra, which is how I can get myself into the network. Social media. So we all love our social media, but it is truly a treasure trove of information. We have things like Facebook and LinkedIn, Google+, Twitter, Pinterest, Tumblr, and many others. This is really useful in doing social engineering campaigns and spear phishing campaigns against employees, and we can really target who we want. For example, if I can find out that the receptionist has a child at a particular middle school, I can send emails crafted as if I'm from the middle school. If I go to LinkedIn, I can find resumes and history. If I go to Google+, I might find some things about what people like to do in their off time, and I can use that to create patterns of life. Again, these are all different ways that we can start getting more and more information to figure out how we want to attack this network. One of the tools we're going to use in our lab is what's called Creepy. And what Creepy allows us to do is go after networks like Google+ and Twitter. We can actually put in a username or keywords and it will find the tweets and the Google+ entries associated with those. For example, we're going to use Titancipher, which again is that made-up account that I have, and there's a Twitter account associated with it. We can go and pull all of the tweets that that person has made, we can geolocate them and start establishing pattern of life, time of day, and where they are and what they do. The next tool is one that comes inside of Kali Linux. It's stored in the scripts folder, and it is a tool written by Lead Bard. It's called Discover. Discover combines many information gathering tools with a single script that gives you a menu-driven interface. You can run discover.sh, which is a shell script to start the script, and then we can start going through and doing different things with it, such as our recon for our domain, our person, or our Salesforce. We can do scanning. We can use Iceweasel to search websites. We can crack Wi-Fi passwords. There's a lot of tools. There's about 15 or 20 tools all shoved into this Discover script, and it makes your job much easier. And finally, we get to Maltego. Maltego is a graphical tool that allows you to do some basic enumeration and reconnaissance. It kind of combines some of our step 1 and step 2 steps of the hacker's methodology. Some things we can do is DNS, whois, we can search network blocks and IP addresses, and we can target individuals. Now the thing I really like about Maltego is it does a really good job of visually depicting the relationships between people, information, and the networks they utilize. So for example, as I'm starting to build a network map based on all the enumeration I'm doing, I can start putting that in and start getting a feel for what it looks like. Maltego does a great job. It also can do things based on interactions, kind of like social media. If you think about the old 7 degrees of Kevin Bacon, if I know Joe and Joe knows Mary, then I know Mary by 2 steps removed. Maltego will start showing you those relationships. By building that, it will help me craft better social engineering campaigns and better exploitation. Maltego is also included as part of Kali Linux. So how do we put all this together? Well, at this point we've collected examples of emails, names, phone numbers, server addresses, documents, presentations, and much more. We've even gotten PDF files and Word files and Excel and PowerPoint, and we can embed malware into those. We can use real employee names, positions, and writing styles to mimic their emails. We can take all that and conduct a really realistic spear phishing attack. Or, if I have a domain name, for instance, I own titancipher.com for my hacking competitions, I could also buy titancipher with a y.com. Now, if I have that one, I can use that as a watering hole. I can make it look just like the original titancipher.com, but embed malware in there. That way, when people come to go to titancipher.com, if they mistype it, they go to the incorrect site. So for instance, if you had Google with 3 O's instead of 2 O's, or Yahoo with 3 O's instead of 2 O's, something like that will allow us to have similar domain names that people can get mistyped and go over to us. Also, we can identify subdomains. If we find developer sites or mail servers, those are possible keys for exploitation, especially if we can find something like a developer site, because developer sites tend to run beta software as they're developing things, which mean they have more bugs and more vulnerabilities. These are just some of the ways that we can find a foothold into the network. Next, we're going to put some of these tools in action, and we're going to play with them in the lab environment. It's time to get creepy. In this lab on Reconnaissance, we're going to learn about the power of harnessing social media sites for information gathering. We're going to use a tool called Creepy. It's an open source intelligence tool that gathers geolocation information from a variety of social networking platforms, including Twitter, Flickr, Instagram, and Google+. Creepy gives us the ability to gather all the information from all of these social networking sites, present them in a graphical format on a map, and allow us to search that based on location or date. This allows us to create what we like to call a pattern of life, where we'll determine what our target was doing, when they were doing it, and where they were doing it. You might wonder why I need to know all of this information. Well, part of a hack sometimes comes down to having physical access to the facility. And if we need to gain physical access, we're going to really need to know when our victim is and isn't at home. Creepy allows us to build that pattern of life to determine the best time to conduct our attack. Creepy is available for Linux, Windows, and Macintosh systems. Creepy used to be loaded by default in Kali, but the latest version you actually have to download and install it yourself. We're going to walk through that in a minute since we're all going to be using Kali as our attack platform, but you can also download and install this to your Windows or Mac machine if you want instead. Since Creepy does require internet access, we're going to reconfigure our network adapter on our Kali Linux virtual machine. If your virtual machines aren't already open, you're going to need to open VirtualBox at this time. From the VirtualBox Manager, we're going to select our Kali machine, and then we're going to click on Network. From here, we're going to select our internal network, which prevented us from reaching the internet, and making it go to NAT. This stands for Network Address Translation, and will actually allow the virtual machine to use the network adapter of your host machine. And then select OK. At this point, we're going to power on our Kali machine, and we'll have internet access. To begin to install Creepy, we're going to open the terminal. We're going to use pip to do the installation, but first we're going to upgrade pip. So do pip install upgrade pip. Next, we're going to install Creepy. To install Creepy, we're going to do pip install -u pytz python qt Flickr API Python Instagram Yapsy Tweepy Google API Python client Python dateutil config object and dominate. Next, we're going to need to download the Creepy software itself. So next we're going to open up Firefox and go to github.com/jkakavas/creepy/tarball/master to download the source code. And then we'll save the file. Going to go into the Downloads folder. And from here we're going to unzip the tarball by using tar-xvz and then the name of the file. You'll see that now we have a folder for that. So we'll go into that folder. Next we're going to go into the Creepy folder. And from here we're going to run creepy main by doing python creepymain.py. Now from here, before it will work, we're going to have to set it up with our particular social media accounts. So we're going to go up to Creepy, and then go to Edit, Plugin Configuration. And from here, we're going to run the configuration wizard. For our example, I'm just going to use Twitter. Click on Next. And then authorize the app. You'll need this pin, type it in the bottom, and then click Finish. And now our Twitter is going to be set up. You do the same thing for Flickr, Google+, and Instagram. Now if you want to make sure it works, you can try the test plugin configuration, and it will tell you if it's able to reach Twitter through the API. And then hit OK. So now at this point we're going to create a new project which is going to be set on our target set. So I'm going to go to Creepy and go to New Project. I'm going to do a person-based project. I'm going to give it a name. In my case, and you can follow along, we're going to use Titan Cipher, T-I-T-A-N-C-I-P-H-E-R. It's a website that I own, as well as a Twitter handle that I have that I use for hacking competitions, and I've dropped some hints there for us to play with in this example. Some keywords we're going to use are things like Titan Cipher, both with spaces and without, and then things like hacking, or anything else that has to do with that company. In this case, Titan Cipher is a hacking handle, so I'm going to throw that in there. And then for a description, this is just for your notes for later. I'm going to do person-based project for Titan Cipher. And then we will hit Next. What are we going to search for? Well, I'm going to search for Twitter, and I'm going to search for their username, in this case, Titan Cipher. Now you can just go to twitter.com/TitanCipher and you'll be able to find them. But I want to look for them. I can look for them by email address, their full name, their ID, their username, anything of that nature. And I'm going to search. I can search across all those platforms. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and search. And I did find one that is a Twitter-based one that is Titan Cipher. So I'm going to add him to my targets. And then at this point, I'm going to click on Next. I can look at things that he's retweeted. I can exclude replies. In my case, I'm going to leave the replies on because I want to find as much information as possible. And then I'm going to hit Next. And then Finish. So you're going to click on Analyze Current Project, and you'll be able to find everything that this person has done. So I'm going to zoom out. And I see that there's some stuff here in Glen Burnie. There's some stuff here in Fort Meade, both of these being in Maryland. Only have a couple tweets there. You see there's two. There was some up here in the New York, New Jersey area. If I zoom out, I'll see some that are in Colorado. And you'll see there's a big pocket here in what looks like Hawaii. So we can pick any of these to look at, and we can actually search based on location if there was something we were interested. For instance, if it was a company's headquarters, we might look at that for a location to find out what tweets across the internet have been done at that particular company's headquarters. And so any employee who's tweeted with their geolocation on, we can start creating patterns of life on that. In my case, I'm going after a person's pattern of life. Now if I roll over to the side here, you can see, we can scroll this date back a little bit. You can see that we had Fort Meade, Maryland, New York Liberty International Airport, Pearl City, which is in Hawaii, Laie, Honolulu, lots of tweets in Honolulu, a hotel in Honolulu, Colorado, again an airport, and then Baltimore, Washington. And if you look at the times, you can see when these happened. This was early November, and then going up it got later and later as the days went on that this person was tweeting. So in our case, let's go ahead and open up Newark International. So in this case, we had a tweet that said, "Can you guess my flight number?" Now if we pull up this person's actual tweet, if we click on the tweet, we can see where the original tweet was. And the question was, can you guess my flight number? So let's click on their tweet. It will open up with our web browser. And we can see the person was waiting to board a plane. So we have two pieces of information. We have their gate numbers, C114 and C115. We have also, there's a United sign here, so maybe it's a United flight, makes sense. And then we also know when they tweeted this, which was 17 November 2016 at 3:56 a.m. So, do you think we could start Googling around and figure out what this person's flight number was? Well, they're probably either at C114 or C115. So we seem to have a lot of Honolulu tweets. So we can see that they're sort of in a downtown area, and we can start looking at what buildings are around there, what times of day. So as this person would move around and have different tweets, maybe they ate lunch every day at this building over here, but they worked in this building over here. We can start figuring out that time of day and the way that the person does. Now, the thing you have to be a little bit careful with this geolocation is it does it based off cell phones. So in the case of this person, if we zoom out, you can see that they're kind of on the side of this mountain ridge here, which is actually the one of the craters in Honolulu. And the downtown area is over here, and there's some tweets over here as well. In this case, this person may be tweeting from anywhere in this area. And the reason why is the cell phone tower that does the location, there's a lot of cell phone towers up on the ridge of this mountain, so that can actually throw things off for us. So if we look down here, we have a status. Do you have any idea where I'm staying this time around? If we click on that, we can look at the actual status itself, and we can start getting clues. There's this waterfall, which is probably something that we can see. There's this tower number, and then, of course, they even translated it for us into what the actual property is, which is the Aston Waikiki Banyan. Now, using this information to create a pattern of life is helpful. Let's assume that this person that we're targeting lives in Washington, D.C., but we're now seeing that they're tweeting from a place like Hawaii. If we need to gain physical access to their office, this might be a good time to conduct that attack, right? Of course it is, because now they're halfway across the world. They're less likely to catch us. What if instead we developed a pattern of life showing that the office staff tended to take lunch every day between 12 and 1? Well, this might be the best time for us to conduct an attack because there's less people in the office and less staff means less eyes looking for us. This is a good time to break in. These are the type of things that we're going to piece together using a program like Creepy. It helps us give one piece of information and we add another piece and another little bit here and a bit there until we put all these bits together to create this fuller picture of the situation. Now, Creepy only gives us the information on people and locations, not a whole lot about the network itself. Next, we're going to begin using open source intelligence on the network itself so that we can gather the information we need for our attack. After all, the reconnaissance phase is where we're going to spend 80% of our time. Preparation is key to the successful hack. CentralOps.net and sites like it are a wonderful resource for the hacker, as it helps to provide some anonymity during our assessments. CentralOps allows us to create a domain dossier or email dossier on our victims, gathering openly available information such as the owner of the domain names, the technical contacts, technical details, and the network ranges involved. This is key information that's required for us to gather as we attempt to understand the victim network and plan our attacks. We can use CentralOps from any computer with a web browser, and since we already have our Kali machine connected to the internet, that's what we're going to use. So from our Kali machine, we're going to open up Firefox. From here, we're going to go to CentralOps.net. So once we get to CentralOps.net, we're going to go to the domain dossier. So now we need to pick a domain to look up or an IP address. For our example, I'm going to use AVG. So AVG is an antivirus company located in the Netherlands. So we're going to look them up. And we're going to choose all 5 options. We want the trace route, the service scan, the DNS records, the who is of both network and domain. And then hit go. So the first thing we're going to see is our address lookup. And this is just going to do a basic check of the name to the IP address. In this case, AVG will resolve to 2 different IP addresses as displayed here on the screen. After that, we're going to see the domain who is record. Now with a large company like AVG or a Yahoo or a Google or somebody like that, you're not going to get as much detailed information as you would if you had a small business. So in this case, we can look at who they registered their domain through, which in this case was Mark Monitor Incorporated. So we can see that, and that might play into a spear phishing campaign, but it's probably not real helpful for us right now. We're going to go ahead and scroll down even further. The next thing we're going to come to is the detailed who is record. And in here we're going to see the registration information. We're going to see who the person is registered to. In our case, since it's a large company, they just put in domain administrator. If it's a small business, you usually see the owner of the business's name or their technical support people. You also will get information such as where they are. In this case, they are located in Amsterdam with the street name listed there. You also get phone numbers. This can be useful as part of a pre-texting campaign as well. And you'll get an email address In the case of a large company like this, they probably are not monitoring this address, but it's domain administration at avg.com. If we had somebody's username in there, for instance, jason.dion at avg.com, that could tell us the naming structure for email addresses that could be useful in a spear phishing campaign, or a good point of contact to use as part of a spear phishing campaign, such as the technical registration point of contact. If we had that information, we can use that as a way into the network. We're going to continue scrolling down, see what else we can find. Again, domain administrator, not the most helpful thing because again, this is a large company. One of the things I noticed that's kind of interesting is their name servers. If you notice they're using acame.net. Acame is actually a large network service provider. They actually can help prevent denial of service attacks from occurring. So if that was going to be our strategy to take down this network, it may not work as well. If they're a small business, they're probably not using Acame, and that may be a way that you can take down their network. But again, a denial of service is never used in ethical hacking. There's really no reason for it. But it's something we can consider using our research here. We're going to go down to the network record. Now the network who is a little bit different. You'll notice here it actually gives us a range, 93.184.217.0 up through 0.31 is actually being owned and operated by AVG. That means they have 31 IP addresses, 30 of which are routable on the internet. That is 30 possible targets, whether they're routers, firewalls, or actual servers tied to the internet, that we could be looking at, if that is within the scope of our assessment. As we go down a little bit further, you can notice who actually registered for these IP addresses. Derek Sawyer. So again, that can be a name that we can use as part of a pretexting campaign. It might be a name that we use as part of an email phishing campaign. Lots of different uses when we find good names and good email addresses for people. We're going to go down into our DNS records next. So in our DNS records, you'll see the DNS records for avg.com. There's two address records as we saw earlier. We see 93.184.217.9 and then we see 93.184.211.28. These are two different servers that are answering up for the name avg.com. This is probably being done because AVG is such a large company. One server couldn't handle the load, so they have two servers that are acting as content switches to provide that service to their customers. And then again, we see acame.net as the name servers answering up. So again, it's going to be load sharing and helping to handle a large amount of load that would come against those servers. Next, we're going to look at traceroute. So it starts out from the servers at Central Ops and goes out across the internet until it finds where it's going. In this case, once we get to the stars in line 10 through 13, that's usually where it hits firewalls, and some companies will not respond to pings or trace routes, and the reason why is they don't want you mapping their network. So we know they have at least some firewalls and some border security there. Again, we already figured that out because of the acame.net being the ones answering up for their domain name, so we know that they're pretty secure. Now we'll move on to the service scan. And here in the service scan, you'll see that FTP timed out, SMTP timed out, web browsing port 80 is open, POP servers, IMAP server, and HTTPS all have timed out. And this is pretty typical when using a large company like AVG. So let's do another domain dossier. This time we're going to use a small business. From domain dossier, I'm going to go to titancipher.com. And I'm going to use service scan and traceroute, and then hit go. Now titancipher.com is a domain that I own. It's hosted on a small server. It's used on a WordPress platform, which is actually hosted by Bluehost. And as we go through, you're going to see that. It's going to look a lot different than the AVG answers we got last time. So in this case, we have a single IP address, which is answering up for TitanCipher. If we go into the domain records, you'll see that it's bluehost.com. That tells me who they're using. And the fact that they're using Bluehost tells you they're probably using WordPress as their platform, because Bluehost is known for that. So if you can find vulnerabilities in WordPress, you can then use those against that particular domain. Next, we're going to scroll down and you'll see more information about the actual person who owns it, their name, their address, their phone numbers, and their email addresses. All information that could be useful, again, for a spear phishing campaign or something of that nature. Network who is. So network who is, again, that's going to show us who owns the IP addresses. In this case, it's actually owned by Unified Layer Networks. They own a large block, then they've given part of that block to Bluehost, who then gave a single IP to titancipher.com. So if you notice here, they have a Class A address, So with a /16, they're going to have over 64,000 IPs. You don't want to just go in there blindly and scan 64,000 IPs if you're targeting one TitanCipher.com. It wouldn't make any sense. So this is going to help you identify who owns the network and what parts of the network there are. We're going to scroll down a little further. And we're going to find the DNS records. Now the DNS records here are going to show us that there's a name server answering up, bluehost.com. TitanCipher is being answered up by Bluehost, who is their provider. They do have a mail server, mail.titancipher.com. They do have a name server, second name server on Bluehost. We also see their A records, which is their IP address. Next, we can look at the trace route. This trace route you see looks a lot different than the trace route we saw with AVG. In this case, everybody is answered up. We get both the IP addresses and the fully qualified domain names. So we know every single piece between central ops and that particular server that's answering up. Now notice the last server that answers up, that .193. Something quite interesting here. When it resolved, it didn't resolve to TitanCipher.com. Can you guess why? Well, the reason why is that this shows us that it's a shared server. It's not owned exclusively by TitanCipher. In fact, it's owned by Unified Layer, who owns Bluehost. So there may be 20, 30, 40, 50 different websites on this particular server. TitanCipher is just one of them. Now that's important to know, because if you try to hack TitanCipher.com, you may not be hitting TitanCipher.com. You may be hitting some of these other servers in there. And if you do that, you'd now be breaking the law because you were only hired for an assessment by this one company. So you have to be very careful when you start looking at where they're hosted. This is really important information when we look at the domain dossier. Next, we're going to go down to our service scan. And the service scan, you'll see that they're using FTP. That's a known vulnerability for us. And it even tells us what type of FTP, in this case, pure FTPD server. That's an important piece of information that we could use if we were going to hack this company. SMTP times out, therefore it's not answering up for SMTP. That's good to know. Don't throw any SMTP attacks. They are running a web server. They're running Nginx 1.10.2. We now know the version number and the software they're using. That's useful to find vulnerabilities. Again, all we're doing here is information gathering at this point. POP3 server does answer up, so there is something listening there. IMAP 143, another mail server. It's answering up as well. Things that we need to take note of. If we get into their secure site, we see port 443, secure HTTP server. So with secure HTTPS, we can see their SSL certificate here. They're using a SHA-256 RSA token as their server validation. That is information that can be useful. Bluehost.com is the ones who gave them that information, so we might be able to use that as part of a spear phishing campaign again. You can see the fact that we have Apache running as the server. You see that there at the bottom, HTTP 1.1 200 OK, server Apache. Again, more information that we want to take note of. They also have a PHP session ID. That's something else that we could take note of. We see jasondion.com/WP. WP usually stands for WordPress, so that could be vulnerabilities we could take care of. So these are all different things that we can look at as we move forward in our exploitation later on. The next thing we're going to look at is our email dossier, and we'll just click on that. And then we're going to give an email address that we want to test out. If we had email.test@hotmail.com, for instance, let's see if that's a valid email address. Click go. We find out that it is a bad email address because it was rejected by the server. Now instead, if I use an email address that I think is valid, for instance, titancipher@gmail.com, hit go. We'll see that this passed the validation test. As we scroll down, we'll see that it actually found the MX records for Google for that particular address. And when it tried to make a connection over SMTP to Google to say, does this email address exist, we can see that it did come back and say that it was successful right here, showing us that that was a good, valid email address. Let's try another one. What if we had one like titancipher23@gmail.com? Let's see if that's a valid email address. We hit go. Bad address, does not exist. So if we tried to start sending spear phishing emails towards titancipher23@gmail.com, they would just get rejected. But titancipher@gmail.com does exist and it would be a valid address to use. Where this becomes helpful is when we start looking up information on the company. For instance, if we go back to AVG. If we think their naming scheme was first name dot last name, and we found a name of someone who we think is an employee, John Smith, we can try in here john.smith@avg.com and see if it comes back as a valid or invalid address. This will help us know what is good addresses and what are bad addresses. If you start sending a lot of emails to a server with bad email addresses, that server will start realizing that it is spam coming from your address and they'll block you down. You always want to be targeted in your approach. You don't want to just shotgun things. You want to be precise like a sniper. This was just one of the tools that you can use during a reconnaissance phase. There's literally hundreds of different tools available out there, but this is just one that I particularly happen to like. I recommend that you try out various tools to figure out which one works for you and your style. Now during the rest of our course, we'll be skipping over the reconnaissance phase. This is because our virtual lab we built is separated from the internet, and therefore there simply won't be any openly available information available for us to find. This lesson was to show you the process that an attacker goes through in collecting some of the basic information they need in order to develop their attacks. Now that the reconnaissance is complete, we're going to move on to phase 2, the scanning and enumeration phase. Welcome to the scanning and enumeration phase. In this phase, we're going to be poking around until we can find the hole for us to exploit in our next phase. So going back to our attacker's methodology, we've already performed our reconnaissance, and so now we're actually going to be looking at doing our scanning and enumeration. After this, we're going to move into gaining our access, which is going to be where we actually are going to do our exploit. So scanning and enumeration. Scanning is, again, that active connecting to the system. We're actually starting to poke at the system, try to figure out what ports are open, what services they're running, and what versions they're running. Now enumeration is when we start doing the in-depth gathering. At this point with our enumeration, we actually have found the open ports, and now we're going to identify those services on those ports. So for example, if I found that they're running port 21 is open, that's an FTP port. That's scanning. But once I go and do a little bit further research and I figure out that they're actually using VSFTP, that actually is going to be enumeration. We're going to compile all this information so that we have a lot of information to work with as we begin doing our exploits. The last piece of this phase, after we have scanned and enumerated, is identifying what those vulnerabilities are and what exploits may be available so that we can move into our gaining access in the next phase. So the question always is, what tool should I use? And there's a lot of different tools out there for this. Now, there's no good single tool. There's no one single source. And the reason for that is every tool does something a little bit differently. Some tools you have to pay for. Some are free and open source. Some tools are easily detected, while some others are more covert. So it's really going to depend on what you want to do. There's other tools out there that when you run them, they're going to crash services on the victim machine, which then is going to create a denial of service and you're going to get caught. So you have to be very careful with some of these tools. So what are we going to use in our class? Well, we're going to use ZenMap. And ZenMap is a graphical front end for the Nmap scanning program. Now Nmap is by far the most popular scanning program in the world, and ZenMap lets us harness all that power in an easy to use graphical format. It's a free and open source product. It runs on Windows, it runs on Mac, and it runs on Linux, and it is installed by default in Kali Linux, which is our penetration testing platform. With ZenMap, we're going to be able to do our scanning of our targets. We're going to do this in a couple of different ways. We can do an ARP scan, we can do a ping scan, we can do NetBIOS scans, or we can even do passive collection using something like Wireshark. And we'll talk about these as we go through as well. So the first one we want to talk about is ARP scanning. Now, when you use this with Nmap, the command is nmap-pr and then the IP address. And this will do the scanning using ARP. There's a lot of advantages to this. It's low level, it looks like legitimate traffic, and it's never going to be blocked by a target because you physically have to have ARP enabled for your networks to run. Essentially what ARP does is its address resolution protocol. It's what translates the MAC addresses into IPs and IPs into MAC addresses. Now the disadvantages that we have with this is that you can't go across to a different subnet. So in our lab, for instance, we're going to be using the 192.168.56.something subnet. And so if we had somebody on the 192.168.1.something subnet, we won't be able to use ARP to do that scanning. Now for us, that would be fine because we're going to keep everything inside the same subnet, but by doing that, you have to have access to that network. That's a drawback of using ARP. So how do we get by that? Well, you migrate on to what we call ping. Now when we do a ping scan, we're actually using ICMP traffic, Internet Control Messaging Protocol. And the way we do this is we can use a regular ping command in Windows or Unix, and we just do that by doing ping in the IP address, or we can use Nmap to do it by doing nmap-sn and the IP address. The advantages of this is you can use this locally or remotely. It can go across subnets, which is great because we couldn't do that with ARP. The other thing that's nice about it is it uses the layer 3 protocol, so we're going to get back a time to live. Now the usefulness of having time to live is we're going to be able to make a determination, at least a rough guess, on what operating system it's using based on the time to live that we receive, and we'll talk about that in a minute as well. So what are the disadvantages to ping? Well, It's blocked by many firewalls. Some network IDSs are going to log the ping activity, and so you may get caught if you're doing a bunch of ping sweeps. And it's typically used by both system admins and hackers. The good news there is system admins use it, so it can look like legitimate traffic. The bad news is lots of hackers use it, so it also puts you in that negative category, which is why those network IDSs are logging this activity. So beyond ping, we can actually move into what's called traceroute. And we talked about this in the last lecture for Reconnaissance as well. And we can do that using Nmap as well. We can do nmap-traceroute and the IP address. The nice thing about doing it this way as opposed to a ping is we're also going to get all the IPs of the routers along the way. Now the bad thing of this is it is blocked by some firewalls, just like ping, because again it's that ICMP traffic. The next one that we can use is NetBIOS. And NetBIOS is actually something that's used by Windows. It blends into a Windows environment very well because Windows is sending NetBIOS requests all the time. And what NetBIOS does is it converts the IP addresses to that Windows workgroup name or that host name on the network. This will actually be able to give us a lot of details about the host. We can find out if it's a member of a workgroup or a domain. We can find out its host name. We can find out its MAC address. And we can find out if it's doing file and print sharing across Windows. And if it is, these are vulnerabilities we can later exploit. Now, the thing you have to be careful with NetBIOS is if you try to do a NetBIOS lookup on a Unix machine, that's going to look really odd because Unix doesn't use it. This is really noticeable. It can really flag the defenders. So we talked a minute ago about time to live. Now when we do ping, we do get back the time to live. And that is probably one of the simplest ways to fingerprint and figure out what OS they're running. You'll be able to tell if it's Unix, Linux, Cisco IOS like a router, or a Mac system based on that time to live. It's not accurate though because those defaults can be changed by the system administrator. Most people don't change their defaults, so it will be fairly accurate as far as that goes, but just realize that somebody could change their time to live and make it look like a Windows machine even if they're running Linux. So if you're running Linux or Mac OS X, you're going to have 64 as your time to live by default. If you're running Windows, it's 128. If you're running something like Solaris or Cisco, it's 255. Now these are just some basic numbers to use, and again, they're defaults. They're not the hard and fast rule, but they do give you a good starting point as you're trying to fingerprint that OS. So the next stage after we do our scanning is our enumeration. And we talked about this before, that enumeration is finding out those nitty-gritty details. We're going to determine the OS and the service packet that we're running, and we can identify the machine's role. Is it a workstation, a server, a router, some other infrastructure device? These are all important things to understand. And we're going to use this information to find the vulnerabilities for the identified services. Now by doing this and getting more information, we can be quieter in our attacks. The more we know about the victim, the more quieter and well-refined our attack can be, the less likely we're going to get caught. So as I'm doing my scanning and enumeration, what are the kind of things I should be looking for? I need to look for ports. And the reason I want to look for ports is that there's a port associated with a service. So for example, if I have a web server running, it's going to have port 80 or port 443 if it's unsecure or secure. If I'm running FTP, I'll have port 20 and 21 open. If I'm running something like SSH, it's 22. If I'm running SMTP, it's 25. If I'm running a POP server, it's 110, IMAP 143, remote desktop 3389. All those ports that become important in your certification exams are now coming back and we can identify those. Now, what are some of the ones that I would really want to look for? Myself, I like to identify if it's Windows or Linux. If it's Windows, I'm going to see things like 135, 139, and 445. Those are NetBIOS file sharing in Windows. They're very common in Windows environment, not very common in a Unix environment. Port 445 may be open in a Unix environment as well, and the reason for that is they will run something called Samba, but you're never going to see that port 135 open. That's pretty much a dead giveaway on the Windows side. The next thing I look for is if it's Linux. If it's port 111, 631, or 2049, those are common Linux ports. 111 being remote procedure call mapping, 631 being CUPS, which is printer services, and 2049 being NFS, which is file sharing. So these are some common ports you can identify whether it's a Windows or a Linux machine. Now just because I've identified if it's Windows or Linux, I still haven't identified whether it's Windows XP, Windows 2003, Windows 7, Windows 8, Windows 10. I just know that it's Windows in general. So we'll talk about how to get that specific version identification a little bit later on. So what are some enumeration methods? Well, we can do manual enumeration through something called banner grabbing. And what that is we're going to connect to the target using Telnet. So if I had, for instance, I found port 21 was open, which is an FTP server, I can Telnet against that port 21, and I'll get a response saying, welcome to the FTP server. And part of that will tell me the version number. That's called the banner. And so I can get the operating system this way, I can get the version of the software they're running this way, and that's going to give me more details to do more attacks. Very common things with banners: FTP, SSH, Telnet, and web browsing. So if you find those ports open, do a banner grab and find out what they've got. There's also other tools that will do automatic enumeration for you. So what's the tool we're going to use? Again, we're going to use Nmap. I know I said earlier there's no single tool for everything, but Nmap is a really great tool for a lot of things, and so we're going to use it. Nmap is a great tool because it allows us to scan different layers of the TCP/IP stack. We're going to be able to do pings and traceroutes, NetBIOS, TCP, UDP, and more using Nmap or ZenMap, and that's why we're going to use it for our labs. So what's the great thing about Nmap? It's going to do the scanning for us, and it's going to do the enumeration for us. So when you run Nmap, you can run it very quietly and be very precise, or you can be more broad and more intense. We'll talk about those different profiles in a bit, but if we go more intense, we have the ability to do some of the enumeration and version controls for us, and we're going to do that. Now, one of the ways that Nmap works is it uses different TCP flags. And the way it does that is it's going to actually use the urge, the ACK, the push, the reset, the SYN, and the FIN, and tell us, based on the way that it sets or doesn't set those flags and the responses it gets, what ports are open, what things are answering up, what services they are, what operating system, and what versioning. That's how it does it. It's all about TCP flag manipulation. For example, the urge, which is urgent, even if it's out of order, it's going to transmit first because it wants to get those packets out as quickly as possible. This goes back to our TCP fundamentals that you may have learned in earlier networking classes. ACK is the acknowledgement of the sender's request. Push is push the buffer data to the receiving application as quickly as possible. Reset is when you want to tear down the connection. SYN is used to agree on the number of sequences and start beginning that sequence of exchanges. And then FIN is when we do the graceful shutdown. We finish the connection. We say, hey, I'm done sending you stuff. You may now reset. So normally when we do a handshake, we do a SYN that says, hey, I want to make a connection with you. A SYN ACK is received back from that server saying, I acknowledge that you want to talk with me. And then we send back the ACK, which acknowledges it, and then we can start communicating. Well, Nmap is going to do some of that, whether it's a full three-way handshake or parts of that handshake, and that's how it's going to do the manipulation to be able to figure out what is being used on the distant side. Nmap also has the ability to do OS detection. It can determine what the operating system is. Now, when we do an OS detection, this is a noisy process in Nmap. So it's actually going to scan 1,000 ports on the remote host, and it's going to do it twice. So it's going to do it once, and then it's going to do it again. Now, when it does it, it sends out 6 TCP packets with the SYN flag set. It comes back with the sequence numbers and the window size, and based on those sequence numbers and window size, it can determine if it's Windows or Linux. Now, it's also going to send out 2 ICMP echo packets, and when it does that, it's checking the reply and the sequence numbers that it gets, and by doing that, it's able to get a more refined understanding of what version of Windows or what version of Linux you're using. It also has 1 UDP packet that's sent out to a closed port because closed ports are just as important as open ports. When I send something to a closed port and I see that response, it tells me a lot about that operating system. And then I'm also going to send out 6 TCP packets to open ports with various flag sets, going back with that acknowledge, the SYN, the reset, and see how those respond. Based on all those sending and receiving of responses, I'm going to be able to get a really good idea and get pretty accurate in knowing if it's Windows, Linux, and what version of Windows or Linux it is. And we're going to go through that in the lab as well. The next thing that Nmap can do for us is it can do version scanning. So because we've identified that port 21 is FTP, we can actually do a version scan and determine not only is it FTP, but it's VSFTP version 2.3. This is going to be based on when we send packets of data to that port and the responses we get back. Again, the scans take a long time, so it's best to use less ports. It's also very noisy. So if I have 1,000 ports, I don't want to scan all 1,000. I might choose FTP and I might choose web browsing and go after those 2 first. It's going to send a SYN, it's going to get back a SYN ACK, and once it receives that, it's going to send a reset, which is going to tear down that link. The nice thing about this is it doesn't make a full connection, so it doesn't get logged in most IDSs. But as soon as it's done with that, it actually will go ahead and do a full 3-way handshake, which is again going to be logged, and that's where it's going to review that response to be able to determine exactly the version you have. So that first SYN, SYN ACK, and reset is just to find if the port's open. The second one is really to understand the response and then do that version scanning. So earlier I talked about the fact that we're going to use ZenMap, which is a graphical environment. And ZenMap has 5 default profiles, 5 basic default profiles. They are ping, quick, regular, intense, and slow comprehensive. Now, what a ping does is just that. It just sends out pings. It tells you, is the host up or down? When we do our lab later, we're going to start out with ping and determine what hosts are available on the network. So we're going to start with a /24, which has 254 possible hosts on it, and we're going to do a ping to find out that there's only 2 that are actually up. Then based on knowing those 2 are up, we're going to do a quick scan of those 2. And what a quick scan does is it does the first 100 common ports and comes back with the information on those. After that, we can go to a regular, which does the 1,000 most common ports, And then we can even go into an intense or a slow comprehensive, which again gets us more detail. When I do something like an intense scan, I actually run about 150 different scripts on it so that I can get net BIOS information, version information, operating system information. All of that enumeration is done for me inside that intense scan. So again, it's a little bit noisier, but I'm going to get a lot of great details back. And then slow comprehensive, it's going to do even more of that. It's going to scan every port, it's going to scan every host on the network, and it's going to really run a ton of scripts just to find out as much information as it can. This is really, really noisy. If you're not the system administrator, you don't want to be running slow comprehensive. I would not run slow comprehensive if I was the hacker. I would get caught too easily. And finally, that brings us down to, now that we have done our scanning and our enumeration, what are we going to do with that information? Well, let's assume that I went and I scanned a Windows machine. And on that Windows machine, I found that port 135, 139, and 445 were open. That's Windows file share. Now, I can go to cve.miter.org, which is the Common Vulnerability and Exposure Database. In there, I can search for the operating system version I found, Microsoft XP, for instance. I can search for the fact that they're using file sharing, because I found those ports open, and find out what vulnerabilities exist. Now, as I go through there, I'm going to find a vulnerability that exists. For instance, the one we're going to use, Microsoft 08-067. That particular code is the Microsoft knowledge base article for a bug that they found in 2008 to the Windows XP operating system. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to match that vulnerability to that code, and that code we're then going to use inside our exploitation in our next phase, which we're going to use a program called Metasploit. And in there, we're going to be able to set that exploit. So now we have a vulnerability and an exploit, and when we match those up, we then have an exploitation, and that's how we're going to gain our access. So at this point, we're going to move on and go into our lab environment. Here we're going to actually practice some of these scanning techniques that we just talked about. Now that we're in phase 2, scanning and enumeration, we've got to find a hole in the network in order to break in. Since this is an introductory course, we're going to use ZenMap, which is a graphical user interface for the world's most popular scanning tool, Nmap. ZenMap is truly powerful because it uses Nmap as its workhorse to do all the scanning, but provides us with the easy-to-use graphical interface that makes setting up our scans simple and consolidates all of our text-based output from Nmap into a nice, concise format for us to read. Another great feature of ZenMap is the ability to customize the scan parameters. It provides us the command line syntax that would be required by Nmap to perform the scan, but then allows us to add or change those parameters to make it a more refined scan. The final benefit of ZenMap is that it also creates a database of the past scans, which can be saved for future reference. This is a wonderful feature to aid in your documentation of the network and allows us to go back to those details in the future if we need them. So what kind of information do we need to get started, and what kind of information are we going to find during our scanning? Well, to get started, we're going to need either an IP address or a range of IPs. We should have that information, though, from our reconnaissance phase. Using that information, we're going to perform different scans to determine different levels of information. Our most basic scan are simply pings to determine if the machines are up and responding on the network. This certainly falls into the scanning category in our scanning and enumeration phase. Next, we're going to begin scanning for open ports. Then we'll finally move into more in-depth scans where we can use that information received to perform a basic enumeration of the host to determine the operating system, the version of the software, and more. So let's get started trying to find those holes. Now before we begin scanning our network, we need to set up our network to ensure they're all still on an isolated net. To do this, we're going to open up VirtualBox. From VirtualBox, we're going to go to Preferences, and then we're going to click on Network. And we're going to click on Host-Only Network to create a network just for our virtual machines to use. We're going to click on the adapter to add with the plus sign, and you'll see you now have VirtualBox Net 0. We're then going to click on the screwdriver icon, which is going to allow us to configure it, and it has by default 192.168.56.1. That's fine, we can use that, but we do want to set up a DHCP server, so we'll click on that and say Enable Server. We're going to use 192.168.56.1 as our server. Our mask will be a standard Class C, 255, 255, 255, 0. Our lower bound will hand out IP starting at 100, so 192.168.56.100, and our upper bound we'll use as 50, 192.168.56.150. This will give us 50 IPs that can be handed out to our virtual machines. Since we only have 3, that's going to be plenty for us. We'll hit OK, and then hit OK again. Now we need to set up each machine in network to use them. So we'll click on Kali, and then click Network. Go to Network, and select from Internal Network to Host-Only Adapter. And again, we use the same one we used before, VBox Net 0. Hit OK. we'll go to Windows, we'll do the same thing, click on Network, go to Host-Only Adapter, VBox 0, and hit OK, and then Metasploitable. Click on Network and go to Host-Only Adapter, VBox 0. At this point, we're going to start launching our virtual machines. To do that, we'll simply left-click on the name, Kali, and then Start. I'm going to go back while that's booting up and start up my Windows. And I'm going to go back again and start up Metasploitable. So now we can cycle through those machines and see where they are in the boot process. Once they boot up, they're going to be able to pick up their own IP address using that DHCP. So we'll click on Kali, and then we're going to cycle over to our Metasploitable machine, and then we're going to cycle over to our Windows machine. Now, just to verify that they've actually picked up the IP address, let's go ahead and do an ipconfig on Windows, open up the command prompt, and do ipconfig. And you can see that it got the first IP address, 192.168.56.100. At this point, we can cycle over to our Metasploitable machine. We're going to log in. Again, it's msfadmin, msfadmin for the password. And we can do ifconfig since this is Linux. And you can verify here 192.168.56.101. Now in the real world, your machines are already going to be online. This is just because of our simulation that we have access to them. We just want to know what we're looking at. We're going to go back to our Kali machine. And this is where we're going to do all of our work for the rest of this lesson. So the first thing we want to do is we want to learn what the IP address of our Kali machine is since we've just plugged it into our victim network. So let's go to the terminal. And because this is a Linux machine, we're going to use ifconfig. And you can see here that we got the IP address of 192.168.56.102. Now the network mask is 255.255.255.0, which tells me that the scope on this network is a Class C with 254 IP addresses. So it goes from 192.168.56.1 through 192.168.56.254, with the broadcast being reserved at 255. That's good information to know as we move forward. So the next thing we want to do is we want to bring up ZenMap. And to do that, you're simply going to type in ZenMap from the command prompt. And to make sure my command prompt is still available for me to use afterwards, I'm going to hit the and sign, which means it's going to run it in the background. So now ZenMap pops up and we can start doing our scans. The first scan we want to do is the least intrusive, so we can figure out what machines are on this network. To do that, we're going to do a ping scan. Our target for this network is going to be the entire network. So I'm going to use 192.168.56.0/24. That will tell me that I want that entire subnet. Now, another way you could write this is we can actually say 0 to 254, which would be all of those addresses as well. But in our case, I would like to use the CIDR notation of /24. Now you'll notice here in ZenMap that we actually get the command line syntax for Nmap right here shown for us. So ZenMap is going to use Nmap to do the work for us, but then it's going to take that detail and bring it back to us in a graphical format. Now, right now our profile selected is the intense scan, and that's going to be way too intensive for what we're trying to do. So we're going to go down and select a ping scan instead. Notice that the ping scan is just -SN and the IP address range that you want. And now I'm going to click scan. Now here in this main tab, I'm going to make this larger for us. Now here in this main tab, what you'll notice is you're going to see the results that Nmap would provide you. In our case, all we did was a ping scan, so it searched 256 IP addresses and it found 4 of them that were up. Those 4 is the server, the DHCP server we set up, one of our virtual machines, our second virtual machine, and then our Kali Linux box ourselves. Now we don't necessarily know what these 2 machines are at this point, we just know that they're up and taking requests. But since we do know that 102 is our own machine, we don't need to scan that one anymore because we don't need to attack it. We want to attack these other 2 machines. So what we're going to do is we're going to take it a step further. And we're going to start doing different scans as we can gather different information. Now if you notice, if I click on the ports and host tab, there's no ports yet because we haven't scanned any ports. We've only done, is this machine up or down? But here we can see in the topology our network, and you'll see that there are 4 hosts connected. And we can also do a fisheye that makes it a little bit easier to see. you can see that we do have 4 hosts on the network. We have the 3 machines plus the 1 DHCP server. Now if we look at host details, all we know is the status that it's up. The only reason we know that is because it did a ping. We haven't scanned any ports yet. This is important to realize. So let's go ahead and go back to our Nmap output, and let's try a more intensive scan, but only targeting it to the 2 machines that we want to look at, which were 100 and 101. And from here, we're going to do what's called a quick scan. Now if you notice here, the quick scan is going to do some of the most common ports for us and find what information we can about this. So let's go ahead and do a quick scan. So here's what Nmap would have given you if you were doing this in the command prompt. The scan report for 101, and if we look at 101, you'll see all of these ports are open. That is a lot of open holes that may be vulnerable for us to do exploitation later. Now if you notice that 192, 168, 56.100, all the ports were filtered. Now that's interesting to note because that one was actually our Windows machine, so we're going to have to take a look at that machine later as we go forward. But with the quick scan, we have identified that this 101 is a very vulnerable box. And that was our Metasploitable virtual machine. Now, if we look through it, we're going to see some port numbers, and those ports are going to be important to help us identify what this machine is. So as I look through it, I see that we have FTP and SSH and Telnet. Those are common to Windows and Linux. But the ones that aren't are things like RPC bind 111. This 139 and 445. Those are common of Microsoft and Windows machines. Notice though that there's not a 135, which is another NetBIOS port that's commonly seen on Microsoft. So what this is telling me is that this machine, which I think is Linux, is running some Microsoft services, and they're probably running Samba to do file sharing with Microsoft. If it had 135, 139, and 445, I would assume it's a Windows machine, but we're going to be able to determine it later when we do our enumeration. As we keep going on, we'll see the login and the shell, again, very common Linux things. We also have MySQL, we have a VNC player, and X11. X11 is an extremely common Linux thing, so that again is one of those things that tells us it's probably Linux. Now if we click on the Port and Host tab, there's actually an easier way to see all this information. So if I click on the host I want to look at, and I click on the Port and Host, 101, you'll see that I have open and closed states. In this case, all these were open ports that we're looking at, the port number, and the FTP. So it makes it a very easy to see graphical representation. Now if I click on host details, it doesn't know what type of host this is yet, but it did find that there was 82 closed ports and 18 open ports. And we did look at 100 ports, which was pretty noisy of us. You can see under scans, this is the history of the scans we've done before. We did our ping scan, and now we've done our quick scan. Now if we want to get a little more intrusive, we can do what's called an intent scan. And what we're going to do is do an intent scan, and then we're going to hit scan. Now, the intent scan is going to look at the open ports and the closed ports, and it's also going to try to do some basic enumeration for us to try to figure out what this machine is or isn't. So in our case, we're looking at it. We're doing a stealth scan right now. You can see that. And this scan will take us a little bit longer because it's going through a lot of information. One of the things it does try to do is it tries to do an OS detection. It was unable to do an OS detection of the .100 system. Again, with the text-based information, it's going to give you a lot of information, and we can go through each of this individually if we want, but all of this is going to be shown in a much more graphical format for us to use as we move forward. So let's go ahead and go over here to the ports, and then click on the host. If you notice over here, our OS changed on the .101 machine, that Metasploitable machine. If you'll notice, we have a little Linux icon here. We now see all of the open ports again, but notice the difference here from before. Not only is it FTP, but we know that it's VS FTPD version 2.3.4. This is that enumeration piece. You'll see that our Apache is version 2.2.8. You'll see that they were running Samba, which again, Samba Debian is a Linux version of file sharing to allow it to share with Windows workgroup users. So our guess of this being a Linux machine did pan out to be right. In this case, we have MySQL version 5.0.51. And again, these are all important to know because we can take this information and search the CVE database and be able to find out what known exploits there are for these particular services. So this is all part of that information gathering stage for us to plan our attack. And then we're going to move further down. You'll see here we have a Metasploitable root shell. We have IRC channel, Unreal IRC daemon, and again HTTP with a Tomcat Coyote JSP engine on Apache. So we also have another FTP up here on port 2121. So lots of different things that we can go after as we start attacking this machine later on. Now let's take a look at that Windows machine we had. And you can see here no ports were identified. If we click on host details, it was unable to identify the fact that this was Windows. And if we go to Linux, you'll see that this not only was able to figure out that it was Linux, but that it's most likely Linux 2.6, somewhere between version 9 and version 33. That's going to go, and it gives us an accuracy used based on the ports that it saw. So based on what ports it had and the responses it received from those, it's able to tell us with 100% accuracy that this is Linux 2.6. It also does this based on TCP sequencing. In our case, it didn't do a very good job of it. It also can do this based on IP sequencing. Our case, it didn't collect any of that. And again, more TCP sequencing. And then we have some comments that we can look here in the bottom. There were no comments. So based on the ports used and the way that it responds, it understood that this was Linux with 100% accuracy. So it did a lot of that enumeration for us. Now, Windows has not been responding. Let's go take a look at our Windows machine and see why that is. Let's go into our control panel. We'll go to our security center. So you'll notice the Windows firewall was on. We're going to go take a look at the Windows firewall and see if that's the reason why it's not responding to us. So in this case, we have the firewall on, and the only exceptions are the ones in the exceptions tab. If we look here, there wasn't a whole lot of exceptions. If you notice, file and print sharing was not an exception. Let's go ahead and let that be an exception right now because most home networks are going to use file and print sharing to be able to share files and printers across their network. And then let's hit OK. Now let's go back and try our scan again. So now that we've set the exception in the firewall, we're going to scan the Windows machine again using that quick scan. That's going to do the 100 most common ports. So we'll scan that machine. And you can see now, because we've opened the Windows file sharing and allowed that exception, that we can now identify port 139 and port 445 as part of that machine. Now if we go to the host details, let's see if we can figure that out. We still can't figure that out yet. So we're going to have to do a more intensive scan. We'll go back here and do an intent scan on 100, just the one machine, and we'll scan again. Now it's discovering the open ports on 139 and 445. It's going to do a SYN stealth scan to try to be a little bit sneaky for us as it goes through 1,000 commonly looked at ports. Now if they happen to be looking at this network traffic, they're probably going to see this because going port 1, port 2, port 3, port 4, and going all the way down, you're going to end up seeing something. The other thing, because this is an intent scan, it's actually using 138 specific scripts as it goes through and does this. This is how it's able to do things like the enumeration for us. Figuring out what ports were open is fairly easy with a scan, but now it's actually going to use those different scripts. It's going to see those open ports, and based on the way it responded from each of those ports, we're going to be able to determine what version of the operating system it's using. So as we scroll up here in our text, we can see some information that was found from the scripts. Again, port 135 and 445. We believe it's Windows XP based on the way it responded. We also get the MAC address, and based on that MAC address, we know it's a virtual box. In this case, we also can see the operating system scan was unreliable because they couldn't find at least one open and one closed port. They only found those open ports. The firewall blocked the rest of the ports from us, but they believe that it's Microsoft 2000 or XP. Now, why would it be 2000 or XP? Well, Microsoft XP and Microsoft 2000 share a common code base. Just like Windows Vista and 2003 share a common code base, Windows 7 and 2008 both share a common code base, 2012 and Windows 8 also share a common code base. So as they move forward in these, you can start seeing this overlap. and you'll a lot of times get one where it thinks it's one or the other or both. Now in this case it did a fairly good job. It realizes it's either Windows XP Service Pack 2 or Service Pack 3 or Windows 2000 Service Pack 4. In this case, it wasn't able to do the prediction through TCP sequence, but it can do it based on the information received from the port scans. Now as we scroll down, we had some enumerations run as well. In this case, it did a net BIOS check. It found the name of the computer. The name of the computer is John's PC. It also gave us the fact that he's in a work group, not in a domain. We also know the fact that we're still, again, using Windows XP based on SMB that we found. SMB being the file sharing. And then it did a trace route. In our case, the trace route goes immediately there because we're on the same network. After it did all the scanning, it runs through a couple of other different reports and scripts, tries to find as much information as it can, and it did all of that scanning in about 50 seconds for one host. This is important to know because if you're doing an intensive scan, it does take some time. This was on a network that was on the same network on the same machine, meaning it was very quick. If I had to go all the way across the internet to another host, and I was scanning numerous hosts, that time goes up. The more time you're spending, the more packets you're sending, the more likely you are to get caught. In our case, we sent out 2,035 packets, but we only received 15 back. So the chances of us getting seen was 2,035 times that we sent information to them. There are ways we can be a little bit more sneaky with these tools. It just depends on the profiles we use and the way we configure them. Now, as we go into ports and hosts, and we click on our Windows tab here, the .100 machine, you'll see the fact, again, based on that text output we had, in a nice graphical format that we can see. We then go into topology, and we now see that there is some sort of a lock on this, meaning that there was a firewall of some sort. And then we're going to go here to the host, and here we can see that we scanned 1,000 ports, and of those only 2 were open and 998 were filtered. Filtered means that there was some sort of firewall there blocking us. Again, the accuracy, the fact that we are Windows 2000 or Windows, very accurate in this case, and they do that based on the port that they saw. The one they made their decision on was 139, which was a NetBIOS file sharing. And the class is Windows 2000, and as I said before, Windows 2000, Windows XP share a common code base. They answer up the same way, so they look very similar in traffic. So, as you can see, we can be very invasive or very quiet in our scanning techniques. It really depends on the level of information that we're trying to gather. The question now becomes, how quiet do you want to be in your hack? Well, that's going to depend on why you were hired by the organization in the first place. Are they looking for a realistic hack to challenge their defenders and find their weaknesses? If so, then you would want to be very, very quiet to give them a realistic threat. But if you were tasked to provide the defenders a simple emulation of an adversary of a script kiddie, you'd want to be really noisy. And that way they can find you quickly and take you down. It really depends on the intent of the assessment. Again, these tools can be used very sneakily, do the customization, or very loudly. It all depends on how well you understand your toolset, your intent, and your method during the hack. Gaining access phase. So here's the point where we're going to start gaining our foothold into the system. So we've done all of our research, we've done all of our enumeration and our scanning, and now it's the time to actually launch that attack. We're going to gain our access. So at this point in the attacker's methodology, we are going to exploit something in the operating system to be able to get ourselves into that. Whether that's going to be a client side, a remote side, or other type of attack, this is where we're going to do our exploitation. So step 3 is gaining access, and this is where we're going to perform our exploits for the first time in order to gain our access into the system. So we can do this through a client-side or remote exploitation attack. That's things like social engineering, open wireless connections, software bugs, unpatched systems, web application vulnerabilities, backdoors, buffer overflows, trojans. There's numerous ways to gain access, and it really doesn't matter which way we're going to use to gain access. The point is we're going to get our access into the system. Now, as we start going through this in our lab, what we're going to use is a simple buffer overflow type attack. We're also going to use in our lab some other types of things, such as the unpatched software. So if there's a system that hasn't been patched with the latest update, we can take that, use that to our advantage, and break into the system that way. So gaining access. How do we gain access? Well, it's really just a 3-step process. We're going to identify the target with the vulnerability, we're going to find a matching exploit, and then we're going to select a payload. Now, what do those 3 things really mean? Well, a vulnerability is a software coding error, so it's usually a software bug. It could also be a misconfiguration of the software as well that allows us to gain access to the target operating system. So, for instance, if you're running Microsoft Windows and you didn't apply the patch that came out last Tuesday, that is a known vulnerability. That can be something that I can attack. So that vulnerability just means that there is a hole that can be exploited. It doesn't mean that it was exploited. Now if we move on to an exploit is actually the method of delivery that the payload uses to accomplish the goal that it wants to do to get access. So to exploit it is actually to take that vulnerability and find a way to break into the system using that vulnerability. So an exploit is a method of delivery of a payload. And we're going to talk about payloads here in a second, but we want to deliver that payload to accomplish a specific goal. So when we have that vulnerability, it just means there's a hole there. But now how do we actually break in to get through that hole is the exploit itself. So if there was a software bug or a misconfiguration out there that was identified, that's the vulnerability. Now if we reverse engineer that and find a way that we can exploit that, that's where that exploit and that exploitation can occur. Now when we get into payloads, this is the effect. A payload is the effect caused by a virus or other malicious code that we want something to happen. So when we have a vulnerability, that's the hole, we have the exploit, the method, we then do the thing, which is the payload. So the payload is the actual code that's going to be run once the exploit occurs. So if we think about it like a house, for instance, just because you left the front door open doesn't mean the bad guy is going to break in. But if the bad guy finds that you left the front door open and he turns the handle, that's the exploit, that allows him to open the door. But he hasn't really done anything yet. Now once he steps through that door and grabs your TV and walks off, that was the payload, the theft of the TV. So those are how we have that vulnerability, that exploit, and that payload, and how they relate to each other. Now, as we go into our next couple of lectures, we're going to go into a deeper dive here. We're going to go into the lab environment, and we're going to walk through how a buffer overflow occurs, what a buffer overflow is, why it occurs, and how we can use that to our advantage. We're also going to talk about different payloads. We're going to talk about shellcode. We're going to talk about bind and reverse shellcode. And we're also going to go into talking about Meterpreter, which is a specific type of shellcode that we use inside the Metasploit environment, the Metasploit framework that we're using as our attack platform. So as we keep going through this, we're going to go through this gaining access phase. We're going to dive in just a little bit deeper into each of these areas. But again, the gaining access is just a big concept of finding a vulnerability, exploiting that vulnerability, and delivering and executing a payload. Buffer overflows, or dissecting the exploit. So we talked about in gaining access that there's lots of different ways to gain access, and one of the most common is a buffer overflow. Now, what exactly is a buffer overflow? That's what we're going to cover in this lecture. So, first, let's talk about what a buffer is. A buffer is just a temporary storage area that a program uses to store its data. So, for instance, we might have something like a phone number we want to remember, 555-1234. Now, if I'm a computer program, I have to constantly be remembering that, or I need to put it someplace to store it, and that's where a buffer comes in. So let's take an example of a buffer A. It's an 8-bit buffer. It's got 8 blocks for us to put information in. Can I put the number 555-1234 in an 8-bit buffer? Well, sure I can, because I can put 555-1234 and it fits perfectly inside an 8-bit buffer. What happens, though, with a buffer overflow is a program puts more data into the buffer than the buffer can hold. In our example, instead of using a regular 7-digit phone number, what if I end up using the area code as well? Well, now, instead of being able to put the entire number in A, the buffer I was looking at, it's going to overflow into B. And so you'll see it goes 210-555-1234. So when I read from buffer A, I'm actually getting 210-555-. And now when I go for my second program to run buffer B, I'm actually getting 1234, and I don't understand what that information is from. And that's all a buffer overflow does, is it actually goes beyond what is allowed to be stored in a single area. So how does the exploit work? Well, the stack is a reserved area of memory where the program saves the return address when a call instruction is received. So as you can see here, we have buffer 2 with a local variable 2, and then we have our shellcode that we've put in there. And then we put a new pointer to the shellcode, and that might be where the information used to be. So when the computer goes back there, it's going to now see the return pointer that was overwritten and point to my shellcode. So as we walk through this, this will make a little bit more sense. The stack is organized in a first in, last out structure. The first thing that's placed in the stack is the last thing that comes out of the stack. So what happens is the attacker places too much information on the stack, and they can change the value of the return pointer to carry out their attack. So when you go to the new pointer, it's actually going to point to my shellcode and not to the internet browser or to Microsoft Word. So the attacker's code is placed inside the buffer, and the code that's used to run the commands or execute a series of instructions, again that shellcode, is then going to be used. Buffer overflows are a complex topic. We don't need to understand the nitty-gritties of how to actually develop them, but the fact is that many of the techniques that we use inside Metasploit and Metasploit framework are buffer overflow exploits. And so you're going to be using them a lot. This is just to give you an idea of how they work. And the idea is that as you've put additional information into the memory, when the computer hits that part, it's going to slide into it, go to that new pointer, and run that shellcode. So again, where do buffer overflows fall in the grand scheme of things? Usually we're going to use them in our gaining access phase. This is an exploit, so we're going to exploit a vulnerability using a buffer overflow. Buffer overflows are able to be done because of poorly written software. So let's take an example of how this works and see if it makes it a little bit clearer. So there's a wonderful website out there called Over the Wire, and it's got a lot of different hacking challenges. It's a live environment where you can connect via an SSH connection, a secure shell connection, to attempt various binary exploitation challenges, including buffer overflows. Now, this is beyond the scope of this class. It's pretty challenging, but as you start working through and developing your skill set, you'll want to go back to this site and play with it because there's a lot of great challenges there that can really help bring your technical ability up. Now, one of the ones we're going to use here to show the buffer overflow is one in the Narnia series of exercises at Over the Wire. So here's a copy of what the code looks like. This is the actual software code. It's a very short code, less than 20 lines. Now this is a C program they're writing. So I'm going to walk through it with you, so if you don't understand C, that's just fine. You'll be able to follow along, I promise. So don't worry too much about the first two, the includes. That's just saying, here's how I can talk to the computer and receive information, input, output. So inside the main program, we have long value. That's a variable. And they're setting that variable initially to 0x4141414141, which is a hexadecimal value. It's just giving us an initial value to start with. Our goal in this program is we want to be able to change the value from x41414141 to x deadbeef. We're going to set up a buffer of 20 characters. Now, the next thing we're going to look at is print to the screen, correct value from 41414141 to deadbeef. They're going to print, here's your chance, and then they're going to scanf. Scanf just means input, so it's waiting for an input. And it's going to allow us to input from the keyboard, and it's going to input that into the buffer. Now, how big is that buffer again? That's right, we said it was only 20. So if we overflow that buffer, we can actually get it to do things that we want. So the next thing we're going to do is print out what the buffer is. So whatever we typed and hit enter, it's going to print back to us and give us the value inside hex. And so you'll see that there. So if the value that we set was deadbeef, then we're going to get back system bin/sh, which is a shell. So that's going to be our payload. Our payload is we're going to receive the command prompt from Linux. Otherwise, we're going to get an answer of way off, you messed up, you didn't do it right, and the program's going to terminate. It's a pretty simple program. So let's see how that works in the real world. So if you thought this was an interesting topic and you want to learn more about it, I recommend looking at the Shellcoder's Handbook, Hacking the Art of Exploitation, or the Hacker's Playbook 2. All three of these books are great resources. They'll really help you hone the skills that you'll need to work on binary exploitation. Again, it's way beyond the scope of this class to teach you how to really dig in deep into this. This is just to give you a quick overview so you understand what a buffer overflow is and just see what that example looks like. So we're going to begin by opening our Kali Linux machine and opening our terminal. From there, we're going to SSH into the server using our username Narnia0 at narnia.labs.overthewire.org and our password of Narnia0. Once we connect, we're going to cd into the Narnia directory. Once we've done that, we need to look at the actual program that we're trying to exploit. In our case, narnia0.c. To do that, we are going to end up doing cat narnia0.c. And the program's contents will get shown to our screen. So in this point, we can see the actual code itself. You can see it's a C program with our standard I/O headers and our standard I/O libraries. Notice the long value there, 0 times 41414141, and our char, our character, our buffer is 20 characters. So if we put something over 20 characters, we should be able to do a buffer overflow in this case because it'll be greater than what it's expecting. Notice in the program if the value equals deadbeef, then it will give us a shell bin/sh. So what we're trying to do is do an overflow and then write into memory the hexadecimal value of dead beef. So here we're going to execute the program, and we're going to put in an input. In this case, I'm going to put a bunch of A's. I'm counting carefully to put 20 A's and 4 B's. What happened is I overflowed the buffer with the A's, and so the value got overwritten from 41414141 to 42424242, which was the hex representation of those B's. So at this point, I'm going to write a short Python script that will put 20 A's followed by the hexadecimal characters that I want, in this case dead beef. Now I have to put it in a little bit backwards, and that's because of the fact that this machine is using first in, first out, or last in, first out architecture based on this machine. So in this case, I'm going to use the /ef/de/ad/de, and then I'm going to pipe that output into the Narnia.c program, Narnia0.c program. Notice my value has been overwritten with dead beef, just like we wanted. Now notice when I run this Python script, my value does change, but nothing else happens. I'm just returned to the shell, and that's because I executed the shell. Now what I want to do is have it so that when I execute the shell, it does something for me. In this case, I want it to show me what the password is for this stage, which allows me to go into stage 2. The way I'll do that is by using an echo command. And so in this case, I'll use the same Python script I used, then put a semicolon, echo cat/etc/narnia_pass/narnia1, which gives me the code to go into the next level, which would be Narnia 2's level. Then I do the pipe and run the program of Narnia/Narnia0. As you can see, my buffer gets overwritten. Dead beef is written to the value, which then goes to execute the shell, in this case executing my command, the cat of the password for Narnia1. And I get the answer to the riddle, which was EFEIDIEDAE. If I go now to over the wire and use Narnia1 as my username, and I use that as my password, EFEIDIEDAE, I can then go into challenge number 2. And that's just a very simple example of how a buffer overflow works. In this case, we overrode a 20-character memory allocation, pushing in those last 4 characters, whichever we put in there, into the memory, in this case matching up to cause an overrun to run our bin/sh or our shell. Introduction to shellcode. So in this lecture we're going to discuss what shellcode is and why that's important to us in our gaining access phase. So what is shellcode? Well, shellcode is a small piece of code that's used as a payload in the exploitation of a software vulnerability. So this is that exploit piece we talked about during our gaining access lecture. It's easily reused in other exploits as well, so we can use this over and over and over again. There's lots of different kinds of shellcode, and there's several common ones, such as bind and reverse shells. So what does a shellcode do? Well, it typically is going to start a command shell for us, which is why we call it shellcode. We want that command shell, so in Windows that would be the command prompt, in Linux that would be something like the terminal. And this is going to allow the attacker to use interactive command execution on this remote target machine. How do we make shellcode? Well, shellcode is commonly written in machine code, so it's usually written in an assembly language. But any piece of code that performs a similar task can be categorized as shellcode. So it could be written in something like C as well. But most commonly it's going to be written in something like assembly or machine code. Now, why is this important? Well, writing a machine code is pretty darn difficult. Now, most of us are not going to be writing our own shell code. Now, if you're going to be a really good hacker and a really good attacker, you're going to need to learn how to do that. And there's books out there with lots of different examples of shell code and how to learn how to do all the shell coding. We're not going to cover that in this class. That's way beyond the scope. So for us, though, we just want to be able to talk about shell code and understand what it is and how it works. And we're going to show you some examples of that. So there's 2 examples of shellcode, bind shell and reverse shell. We're going to talk about these 2. In our lab, we're going to use a reverse shell, and the reason why is because we want that interactive command prompt. We want it to go ahead, we're going to run the attack, and then get ourselves back a C prompt when we're attacking Windows, or a terminal prompt in Linux for us to attack with. So let's talk about how bind works first. So with bind, the attacker sends an exploit to a vulnerable service. So let's say you're running something vulnerable like VSFTP. And if you're running that, the attacker sends the exploit to the vulnerable service. The shellcode is going to bind itself to that port 21 for FTP, and then the attacker will be able to make a connection, a separate connection, to port 21. That's how bind works. It binds itself to a port. Now, the problem with this is that you have to have those ports open in the firewall for this to work. So if we are the attacker, we're now requiring that the firewall is running FTP and that those ports are open. Now, if we're running an FTP service that's vulnerable, there's a high likelihood that that will be open. But if we're trying to attack something like a web server and you're running something like a Windows desktop, the chances are you're not running port 80 or port 443 on your Windows desktop. You're going to use that for outbound ports, not for inbound ports. So that's why bind shells don't work all the time, but they do work well in a lot of cases. Now, let's talk about how a reverse shell works on the other hand. So a reverse shell is still going to send that exploit to the service. But when it gets to that target, the shell code itself spawns a connection and calls back to the attacker. You're going to see that in our lab. We're going to set up a listening port on our Kali Linux machine so that when we attack the Windows machine, it will call back to our Linux machine and say, hey, I'm ready to talk to you. And the great thing about this is you don't have to pre-open those ports in the firewall. Firewalls are designed so that things from the inside of the network can reach out and call out. Because, for instance, when you go to a web server, you call out on port 80, but you also open a port to come back in on a higher numbered random port. And we're going to do the same thing here to try to hide in traffic. Now, once we do this, the attacker machine, our Kali box, is going to listen for that callback. And once it receives that callback, we get that two-way communication. And that's when we can start doing this executable reverse shell that gives us full interactive communication. Now, there's another type of payload out there that we talk about that's called a staged payload. Now, what this is usually it's going to be the shellcode itself is too large to pass fully through a single stage. It would be caught too easily. So instead what we do is we break up that shellcode into many smaller stages, sometimes 1 or 2 or 3 or even 4. And what happens, this happens to make the attack quieter. So what happens is I can launch the exploit. The original stage 1 payload goes and gets loaded on the victim machine. It then reaches out and gets stage 2's payload. Stage 2 then gets stage 3, and it keeps building until it gets the entire payload we want to make the full connection for us to be able to do our attack. And that's what a stage payload is. You may hear that come up. So how do stage payloads work? Just like we said, stage 1 is going to happen. The attacker is going to pass a small piece of code to the target. Then stage 2 is going to reach out, grab the larger portion of that payload, and then it will have the full executable two-way communication once the stage 2 has been loaded. So in our lab, what are we going to do? We're going to use a reverse shell. So we're going to send out that exploit on the service. It's going to spawn the connection back to the attacker on a given port. In our case, we're going to use 4444, which is the default for Kali Linux. If we wanted to hide, we could try to make it a random high port, or we could do like 443 so it looks like a secure web tunnel. And then the attacker can listen for a connection back on that port. We're going to use Windows/shell/reverse TCP. This is a staged payload. It's a two-stage payload. So you're going to see that we're going to send it. It's going to say stage 1 received, stage 2 has done, and then once we get stage 2, we'll have that two-way communication for us to be able to talk. So all of this is going to be occurring again, once again, we're talking in this gaining access stage. Once we are in and we have the interactive two-way communication, that's when we can then move on to other stages, such as escalating our privileges, maintaining our access, and covering our tracks. So now we're going to discuss the first vulnerability we're going to exploit, and that's the Microsoft 08-067 vulnerability. This was also known as the Netapi vulnerability. Now, everyone tends to use this in ethical hacking as the first hack, and the reason why is it's a fairly easy hack. It works really well, and it works pretty much every single time. So we're going to go through this one first and get our feet wet. Where does this attack fall in? Well, we're going to gain access using this attack, and this attack actually gets us a system-level user. So we're actually going to have an escalation of privilege at the same time. So we're going to be in both phase 3 and phase 4 simultaneously as we begin this attack. So, MS-08067, what does that really mean? Well, MS-08067 is the vulnerability number that Microsoft assigned to this particular bug in their code. It is the Microsoft Server Service Relative Path Stack Corruption. Now, this vulnerability allows for a remote exploitation of a Windows 2000, 2003, or XP system. Now, once we got into Windows 7 and above, they had started fixing this vulnerability and taking it out. Sometimes you'll find that it works on Windows 7, sometimes it doesn't. It depends if the person is actually patched for it. But it works almost all the time in Windows 2000, XP, or 2003 if they're using file sharing services on one of those machines. So what are the requirements for Microsoft 08-067 to work? Well, you have to have a vulnerable service. In this case, the server service is on port 445. That's why I said you have to have file sharing enabled for this to work. When we set up our lab before for our Windows XP vulnerable box, we went and we enabled printer and file sharing. That is so that this vulnerability will work and we can attack it. This requires that the Windows firewall is either disabled or file and print sharing is enabled. And what we did was we left the firewall on, but we opened up the port for file and print sharing. Is the machine still vulnerable? Well, Microsoft released a patch back in October 2008. Microsoft Windows XP Service Pack 3 was released in May of 2008, so this was before the patch was released. So if you have a brand new Windows Service Pack 3 system like the one we made, it's still vulnerable. And again, even though there's a patch available, not everyone puts those patches out. The hotfix knowledge base article is KB958644. If you want to learn more about this vulnerability, you can go in there and read all about it, that Microsoft is giving you the technical details. Because they've given us those technical details, the attackers have been able to reverse engineer it, and now we have this exploit available. In Metasploit, in the Metasploit framework, we have to have an exploit to be able to go against that particular vulnerability. And the nice thing is, with Metasploit, they tend to keep the same naming scheme as Microsoft to make it easy for us to find. So we talked about the fact that Microsoft called it the MS-08067 vulnerability, while Metasploit calls it the MS-08067 Natapi exploit. So when we search for that, we'll be able to find it there. So what this module is going to do is it's actually going to exploit a parsing flaw in the canonicalization code path of the Natapi 32 DLL through the server service. If the process reaches a state where the next instruction to execute is in the stack, the exception is raised. If it's not handled properly, then the process is going to be terminated. So the developers of the exploit have actually taken the vulnerability, reverse engineered it, so we now have an exploit that works. And when the flaw is introduced, instead of terminating, it's going to actually go and run the payload that we desire, which in our case is going to be a reverse shell. So whenever you're setting up Metasploit, you have to set up two main things, and that's your exploit and your payload. It's how are you going to break into that vulnerability, and what are you going to do once you broke in. So in our case, you'll see here that we search for the exploit, MS08_067_Natapi. We use that exploit. We then are going to set a payload, which is what we're going to do once the exploit is thrown. And in our case, we're going to use the Windows Meterpreter reverse TCP. And then I showed you the options. And from here, you'll see that we need to set a remote host. That's going to be who we're going to attack. We need to set a local host. That's our Kali IP, so we know who that remote host is going to call back to. And you'll see here our exploit and our payload are shown here on the screen. So if I run this exploit, what are the forensic examiners going to be able to see? Well, here I pulled up the log files, the application, system, and security log files. Notice that before the attack, the numbers have not changed from before to after. Again, that's because we're using the Meterpreter reverse shell, and Meterpreter runs exclusively from memory. It doesn't actually even get logged in the system. So it's not in the applications, it's not in the system, and it's not in the security. So as you can see, there's very little trace of our efforts here. Now, once we broke in, depending on what we do, that can change the number of records, because we might trip on things that launch applications, that we actually hit the security trip points, or that we actually affect the system. But just running the exploit itself has no effect on our log files, making it a very quiet exploit for us to use. And so now that we've walked through this, and you see that we are going to be able to gain our access and our escalation privileges, we're going to walk through it interactively as I go through the attack in the lab environment. So now that we've gone through our reconnaissance, our scanning and enumeration, we're ready to try to throw an attack and gain access. Based on our scanning and enumeration, we've identified a vulnerability to attack. In our case, it's going to be our Windows machine with Microsoft 08067 vulnerability. So let's launch our Kali machine. We still have all the machines up and running from our previous lab. So from our Kali prompt, we're going to start the Metasploit framework, which is MSF console. Now from the Metasploit framework, we're going to be able to configure our exploit and our payload that we want to send over. So as you can see here, there's over 1,500 exploits, over 400 payloads, so we need to figure out which one we want to use. Now based on our reconnaissance and our scanning and enumeration, we're going to use the Microsoft 08067 vulnerability. Now this vulnerability goes against Windows XP and Windows 2000 servers, and these will actually go against the file sharing capability, and we know that they were running file sharing on port 445. So when I search for that, you'll find it right here. It's in the exploit Windows SMB directory, and it is the Microsoft 08067 Natapi. I'm going to copy that so I don't have to type it out each time, and I'm just going to type in use and then paste it in and hit enter. The second thing I need to do is set my payload. Now the payload is, once we've broken down the door with the exploit, what code do we want them to run? In our case, we want them to run the Windows shell reverse TCP. Now that payload is set. So now we have a couple more options. We're going to do show options, and you'll see here that we need a remote host, which is the target we're going after, and a listening host is the listening we're going to do, which in our case is going to be the Kali machine. So we're going to do set our host to the IP of the Windows machine, which was 192.168.56.100. And then we need to set our listening host to our IP for our Kali machine, which was 192.168.56.102. And now we can show our options to verify those options took. And you can see they did. There is our Windows machine IP, and there is our listening host for our Kali machine. Now, the reason why we're allowed to set this listening host is because in an exploit, I may be the one who is setting the exploits, but I don't want to do all the post-exploit exploitation, and I'll allow my friend to do that. So, for instance, if there was two of us in this room, I might be 102, he might be 103, I'll throw the exploit, the answer that comes back will be to his machine, so he can then do all the information gathering, and that way I might be the guy who breaks down the door, and I have a team of guys who take the information out. The other thing you want to note here is this listening port, which is currently set to 4444. That's the default for Metasploit. It doesn't have to be 444 though. You can set it to 80 or 443 or any other port you need to help you get through and back through a firewall. Now that we've set up all of our configurations, all we have to do to run this exploit is type the word exploit. And you can see that we started the reverse handler on our Kali machine, which is our Kali machine listening on port 4444. It then goes out and sends the exploit on port 445, which was the vulnerability we were trying to trigger, to the Windows machine. It detected that that was a Service Pack 3 Windows XP machine, and based on that, it threw the appropriate vulnerability and the appropriate exploit for that vulnerability. It then sent an encoded stage dropper over to that machine, and that encoded stage was then received, broke in, used the command shell, and sent it back to me. And so now I can see that it went from my Kali machine to the Windows machine, and that is the connection that we have open right now. And notice where we are. We're in the System32 directory in Windows. We have now been dropped into the command prompt of Windows, and we are there as a system level user. So we have the ability to create files, edit files, delete files, or run any other commands that we would using the command prompt as if we were there locally on the machine. So what we're going to do here is we're going to start gathering some information. So why don't we start with something like system information. And what we can see here is a bunch of information about this machine. We can see the exact version it is, we can see what kind of machine it is it part of a domain or just a workstation? This is important to know because if I broke into a machine that was part of a domain, I would then try to go from getting system on this particular machine to being a domain admin and continue to elevate my privileges. I can see information such as the product ID, the date and time it was installed, how long it's been up, how many processors it has, how much memory it has, how much hard disk it has, all sorts of information that could be useful to me. The other thing I can see here is everything that it's been patched for. In this case, the only patch it has is this one particular one, Q1472222, which means that it's Service Pack 3. None of the other updates have been had. So this means that there's a lot of vulnerabilities on this box that I can then go and attack, which is good for us as a training opportunity. But if I was the one who owned this box, I would know, hey, there's a lot of things I got to do to get this up to shape. So what are some other things we can do? Well, let's go ahead and look around this drive. Let's go to the C drive. We'll go to the main root directory of the C drive, and we'll see what's there. Right now, it just looks like a basic Windows machine. We can even go into their documents and settings and see if there's anything there. In this case, we see there's a user, John Sim. And you can see that we're able to access John's information because, again, we're a system level user. Now, he doesn't happen to have anything on there. Why? Because when we set this box up, we didn't put anything there for us to find. We just set up a basic default blank account. But we can now start writing things to John. For instance, we might do something like this. Echo, hi John, I hacked your machine. And then we're going to pipe that over to a file called hacked.txt and hit enter. So now that file should be sitting there on the desktop, which we can see it is. Now if that file was there before, we would be able to see it by typing that file to the screen. So in our case, we would type hacked.txt, and we could see what the contents of that file are. Now for John on our machine, what do we think we're going to see? Well, on his desktop now, we have a hacked file. And we can see that, and that is just proof that we were able to break into his machine. Now, if he had a bunch of information on here, we'd be able to steal that information as well, but in this case of this machine, there wasn't much there. So once we're done with that machine, we would just type exit to get out of the command prompt, and that will actually break the connection between us and that machine as well. And then hit Control-C. Abort the session, yes. And that's the basics of how to hack into a Windows box using the MS-08067 vulnerability. Meterpreter, a crowd favorite for payloads. So we've talked about bind and reverse payloads, and now we're going to talk about Meterpreter. So Meterpreter again is going to be used in our gaining access, and then we're going to use that throughout the rest of our stages, our escalation of privileges, maintaining access, and covering our tracks and setting our backdoors. Now, what is Meterpreter? Meterpreter is a multifaceted payload that operates via a dynamic link library injection, so a DLL injection. And it's included as part of our Metasploit framework, which is that MSF that we're using inside Kali Linux. That's going to allow us to load it and attack onto a victim platform. The nice thing about Meterpreter is that it resides in volatile memory of the target and it leaves no traces on the hard drive. So it's difficult to detect when you're using conventional forensic techniques, which makes it great for us as an attacker, not so great for us if we're the defenders. The nice thing about Meterpreter is it uses DLL injection to get exploited processes, this get PID. Now what happens is it's going to actually hook the Windows 32 API load library, and by doing that it's going to change these lower level APIs inside of Windows to allow us to load the Met server DLL from memory. By keeping it all in memory, it keeps it out of the logs, it keeps it off the hard drive, it makes it very hard for the defenders to go back and find it afterwards. The other great thing we're going to find with Meterpreter is it just has loads of functionality for us. So when we set up Meterpreter, we're going to do this inside the Metasploit framework. So if we're inside the MSF console, we're going to do use exploit/multi-handler. We're going to set our payload, so set payload Windows/Meterpreter/reverse TCP. We're going to set our host and our port, so that's our Kali IP and whatever port we're going to use, 2541, 4444, 443, whatever it is. And then we're going to do our exploit. Now, once we've set our payload, our listening host, and listening port, we'll be able to receive a callback from our exploited host. Now once you get into Meterpreter, you're going to see there's a ton of different commands. Now I'm not going to show you all of them, but if you want to see them all, just type help or question mark once you get to a Meterpreter prompt. So background is going to move the current session to the background, and this is going to allow us to hack multiple boxes at once. So if I have a first exploited target, I can type background, set up a second attack, go after a second box, and then background that and go back to the first one. And I can go between multiple different targets at one time. This is very useful to be able to interact with background sessions. Sessions. If I type in sessions, I'll be able to see all the active sessions I have. So again, I can have 2, 3, 4 different targets online and have active connections with each of them and then switch between them. I can also kill those sessions, kill all of them, or kill specific sessions. So to do that, I'm going to use sessions-I and then the number, that's interact. So if I was going to interact with my first session, it'd be session-I1. Then if I wanted to go to the other one, I'd type background, sessions-I2, and that would get me to the second one. If I want to kill that connection, I would just type sessions-K1, and that would kill the connection to 1. If I want to kill all of them, it's sessions-K. So some other Meterpreter commands that are helpful: the help, the load, the migrate, and the quit. So when you type in help, you're going to get the list of all the commands that Meterpreter understands. This is useful when you're first starting out to start learning how Meterpreter works and what different things there are that you can do. These screenshots you're seeing now come from that help menu. Now, if we go into migrate, that's going to migrate our server from one process to another. Now when we talk about server, we're talking about the Meterpreter server. That's the connection that we have with our victim. So we're going to fork our Meterpreter into a different process. So for instance, if my attack went in through Internet Explorer, that tends to crash a lot. So I would want to migrate out of Internet Explorer into something more stable, like Explorer, which is the file system browser. You also can do this while you're doing your maintaining access and covering our tracks phases. We'll talk about that more later, to hide ourselves or to migrate into another process that might have better permissions that gives us higher level access. So here's an example of migrate. So you'll see up top we have some legitimate processes. We have WinLogon, LAS, Service Host, Explorer, and WAB32Res. Now, when I initially broke in, I'm going to break in using a calc program, a calculator program. So therefore, I'm now sitting in calc. Now, if I migrate, you're going to see that the calc is going to go away, but I'm going to maintain my access. And the way we do that is by doing migrate, and we'll migrate from the PID of 3028 into where I want to go, which might be the Explorer PID of 1064. Some other nice things that Meterpreter allows you to do is you can download and upload files. You can also get your working directories and figure out where you are. Some exploits you do are not going to give you the path name of where you are. So you're not going to see the C:/system32. You might just get a blank prompt. So by using the printing the working directory, I'll be able to figure out where I am on the victim system. Now, the download and upload work just like they say. You type in download in a file name, and it will take that file from the victim and bring it to your local Kali machine. That way you can do that information gathering and be able to use that as part of your exploitation later on. Some other commands we have ARP and ifconfig and ipconfig and netstat and port forwarding and route. We're going to talk about more of these later on in other lectures as we start playing through some of these commands, but this is really just some of your networking commands that you have inside Meterpreter. Here's some additional commands that we have inside Meterpreter. We have clear EV. This is clearing your event log. This is useful during covering your tracks phase. We also can drop tokens or steal tokens so that we can start pretending that we're some other user on the system. So for instance, if I got onto a user box and the domain admin had also been on that box, I might be able to steal their token and impersonate them and start going around the network as if I was the domain admin. We can execute commands, we can get the PID so we know what process we're currently in, we can migrate into other processes, we can reboot the computer, we can revert ourselves back to the initial user we were, we can drop into a shell. Just typing shell will get us to the C prompt, for instance. There's lots of different things that we can do, and as you play with Meterpreter, you're going to get better and better at using it. So one of the things I really like with Meterpreter is that it comes with built-in keystroke capturing. So if I have gotten onto a user's machine, I can actually use keyscan start and start a keylogger on that machine. So if they start going into their bank accounts, their Facebook, their email, I start capturing all those keystrokes, the usernames, the passwords, the things that they're writing. And when I go ahead and do a keyscan dump, I'll be able to see that on my screen. Some other things that you can do here is you can actually do a screenshot. And by doing a screenshot, you can actually capture what's on their screen and see what they're seeing. And you'll get that as a ping image. And that'll be, again, on your local Kali machine, so you'll see what the victim is seeing. It allows you to see in our graphical user environment world what that user is seeing in their world. And so again, to use the keylogger, keyscan start starts your keylogging, keyscan stop stops your keylogging, keyscan dump shows you those keystrokes that have been captured. So here's just a quick example on the screen of what it will look like in Meterpreter. GetUID will tell me what I am. In this case, I want to be system. PS tells me the processes that are open, and I'll be able to see what processes are there. Migrate PID will migrate me from the current process I'm in, that Internet Explorer process or calc process, into something like Explorer or system. GetUID, verify where you should be. I want to be the current user. Because if I want to capture somebody's keystrokes, I have to be them. So I have to migrate into a user process to do that. And now I'll be able to see if I go on a notepad, start typing notepad on your victim box, and then do a keyscan dump, you'll be able to see all those keystrokes that you've had. You'll also see here that Meterpreter gives you the ability to actually access the webcam. You can record audio from the microphone of the webcam, you can see what webcams are available, and you can start taking snapshots from the webcam. So I can actually see the victim that I'm seeing through their computer. Now, ours is a virtual target, it doesn't have a webcam, so these will actually fail on you if you try it in our virtual lab. But in the real world, you can do this and start stealing pictures off of their camera. Another one is elevation commands. We talked about once we gain access, we want to migrate up to a higher user level. Well, one of the ways we do that is get system. It's just automated. You type get system, and on a Windows machine, it will elevate you up to a system level user, if it can. This works about 50% of the time, so it works pretty well and it's worth a shot. It will get you where you want to go most of the time. So some other ways that we can elevate our privileges is we can do a hash dump. Hash dump is actually going to dump the contents of the SAM database. And we'll talk more about the SAM database when we talk about elevation of privilege later, but it's the way that Windows stores its credentials. So if I can dump the SAM database, I get the encrypted hash of all the passwords. I can then break those hashes and figure out what the passwords are. I now have additional accesses. And then finally here at the bottom you'll see timestamp, and timestamp's really useful because as we go into our covering our tracks later, we'll use timestamp to actually change the time that files were accessed. A good use of this is if I go into a log file and edit a piece of that log, it's going to change the date and time to the time that I edited it. Now what I want to do is go back and timestamp it back to the last time it was actually touched, which might have been 3 or 4 weeks ago by the system administrator. And that way I can help cover my tracks further. We'll cover this again in the covering tracks lesson. So in the last lesson, we went and used a command shell, just a reverse TCP, as our payload. I want to show you what happens if we use a different payload. So what we're going to do here is we're going to use a thing called Meterpreter. So we're going to set our payload, and in this case it's Windows/Meterpreter/reverse TCP. And then we'll show our options. You can see we have our same options as before. We have our same exploit set, our same vulnerable Windows machine, but now we have a different payload set up, even though it did carry over the fact that we're still going to listen on this particular Kali machine. So now we're ready to exploit. Notice it sent the stage and it actually got it. But notice our command prompt is a little bit different. This time it says Meterpreter. Now the reason why is we're not actually using the Windows command prompt. We're using Meterpreter as our shell. Now Meterpreter is great. It has a lot of capability. In fact, I'm going to go through a couple of them with you real quick. What we're going to do is start out with the question mark, which tells us all the things we can do. So if we scroll up here to the top, you'll see the core commands. We can send things to the background, we can get timeouts, just some basic housekeeping type information here. But what really gets fun is when we get down here. File system commands. If you're a Unix guy or a Linux guy, this is great because all of our standard Linux and Unix stuff will actually work. In addition to that, we can use our Windows stuff too. So we still have dir, we still have cd, but we also have ls for listing our files. The other nice thing that I really like is the fact that we can upload or download files from a directory. This is going to be really useful as well. Now as we move further down, we'll show you some other things that we have here. We can display the ARP cache, we can do some proxy settings, we can see the interfaces they have and figure out, because sometimes you'll get to a box that is used as a router and we can pivot from one to the other. We can also modify our routing tables. That's some good useful information as we get further into our hacking careers. The other nice thing we have is our system commands. And here are some things that you can do that will help cover your tracks, but they're pretty blatantly obvious. For instance, you can clear the event log. If I clear the event log, the system administrator is going to know he got hacked. The good news is, though, he won't know I'm the one who did it. There's a lot better ways of hiding yourself than just clearing the event log, but that's one way to do it. The other thing you can do is you can execute commands, you can get environmental variables, and you can actually grab tokens and steal tokens from another user. So if there was a domain admin who ever logged into this box, I can steal their token and then use it across the domain. Other things I can do include rebooting the computer, or showing the process list, or killing processes. If I want to get to that Windows command shell, I can do that too just by typing shell. Now, some more fun is when you get down here towards the bottom. This is one of my favorite areas, is the user interface commands. So one of my favorite commands is actually here. It's called grab a screenshot. You just type in screenshot and it will steal a picture of the person's desktop. So if they're using their banking account information, for instance, now I can have their checking account information because I'll see it on their screen. The other thing I can do is I can start and stop key scanners. This will actually start capturing every keystroke that person makes and sending it back to me once I type in scan dump. As we move further down, these won't work with our virtual machine we're attacking, but if you had somebody's real machine, we can actually stream their webcam so I can see what they're doing. I can take a snapshot of their webcam. I can start a video chat with that person or record their microphone and listen to what they're doing. Lots of different things we can do here. And then finally, as we get down here, we have things like get system. So assuming I attack the person using a user-based exploit, not an administrative exploit, I want to elevate my permissions up to the domain admin and up to a system admin. By doing get system, I can get that system level access. Now to get domain admin, I'm going to have to get the dumps of the SAM database. If I hash dump it, I can steal those credentials and then crack their passwords. And then finally, we have timestamp. And what timestamp does is this allows me to manipulate the time on files. So if there is a log file, I might go in there and delete a single line or two and then timestamp it back to the time before I touched it. That will allow me to cover my tracks a little bit better. So while we're here, I'm going to go ahead and hit ls and see where we are. And in this case, I'm in a directory with a bunch of DLLs. Can you guess what directory that is? It's probably the system32. But to double check that, what we're going to do is type in pwd, and you'll see that I am in the Windows system32 directory. Now I talked about screenshots, so let's go ahead and try that one. Screenshot. It saved it to the root file of my Kali box under this JPEG name. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually open that up, and you can see right there, that was that person's desktop. There's the hack file we made in the last lesson. So that's useful because you can start stealing information they have on their screen. So what else might be good? Well, let's look at the hash dump. So if I type in hash dump, I get the hashes for all of those users. I have the administrator, he's a 500 level account, and then here is the hash that's associated with him. There's websites out there you can plug that hash into and it will come back and tell you what those passwords are, because there's a way to break those passwords using landman hashes. Same thing here with John Sim. If we wanted that user account, we could then take his hash, pop that into that website, and come back with the username and the password. This is information that can be very useful to us as we move on. So this was just to show you some of the capabilities that you have inside Meterpreter. We're going to play with Meterpreter a lot more as we go into our Linux machine and start going through those vulnerabilities. But I just want to give you a quick introduction to show you that there's a lot of power if you use something like Meterpreter versus using something like a reverse shell TCP. Escalation of privileges, or I've got the power. So as we've worked our way through, we've now performed our reconnaissance, we've scanned and enumerated, we've gained our access, and now we're trying to escalate our privileges. We want to go from being a normal user to a system level user and then eventually to a domain admin. So this is our fourth step of the hacking process. It's our escalation of privileges. We're going to gain administrative, system, or root access by escalating our account privileges. After we've escalated our privileges, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to have full control over the network or system, and we can gain administrative access over the workstation and then expand out to the domain if possible. This is going to give us complete control of the network where we can do whatever we want. So what are some methods of escalation? Well, we can exploit an administrator or a system to begin with. We can steal passwords with keyloggers, or we can crack the password itself. And we can do that through the SAM database in Windows, or we can use the shadow database inside Linux. So in Windows, the passwords that you have are stored as a binary encrypted hash. So when I go to log into Windows, it actually hashes my password, and then it compares it to the hash that it has stored. If those two match, it then lets me into the system. Now, because it has this database, this SAM database, if we can steal that database, we can take it offline and we could try attacking it and cracking it. Why would we want to do that offline instead of just trying to fat finger and try to brute force our way into the system? Well, most people have set up their systems now so that you can only attempt the password 3 times and then it will lock you out for a certain amount of time. So for example, let's say that I'm trying to guess the password for my user account. And I go in there and I type in 1, and then I type in 2, and then I type in 3. And now I gotta wait 15 minutes and then I can try it again. That can take me forever if I was trying to guess the password. So instead what we do is we try to steal the database itself. We could take it offline and then we can attack it millions of times a second with a fast computer and not have to worry about being locked out because the system isn't being tested, just the password to see if I've matched the encryption. So how do we steal that SAM database? Well, one of the ways you can do it is physical access. And physical access means that I actually I'm able to touch the machine I'm trying to attack. So if I get into the office and I can copy the SAM using the NT emergency repair disk, or I reset the user password using NTFS-DOS or Linen, then I can take that and just take that password from the physical access. Now, if we're hacking remotely, that's not going to be an option for us. So in that case, we need logical access, using something like Meterpreter where we can do a hash dump. Now, once we have that hash dump, we can then use that hash dump to try to crack those passwords and do something like pwdump, LCP, orfcrack, or John the Ripper. Lots of different password cracking tools out there once we have this database that we can then compare to. Now, there's many different authentication types used in Windows. There's landman authentication, there's NT landman authentication, NT landman version 2 authentication, and Kerberos. So we're going to talk about LM authentication. So LM authentication is landman authentication. It was used by Windows 95, 98, and ME. and it's based on DES, which is the Data Encryption Standard, making it very easy to crack. DES is only 56 bits long, therefore most modern computers can crack it fairly easy. Now the reason why this is important is it's still used for backwards compatibility in some systems. So you may be able to find some landman passwords. If you do, they're easy to crack, go and use those. Because landman had gotten kind of outdated because of the sophistication of computers, they upgraded it and it became NT landman. And NT landman was used in the Windows NT systems, anything less than Service Pack 3. Again, very old systems, but it is still used some places for backwards compatibility. This was based on DES again, so 56-bit keys, as well as using a hash of MD4, which again is very antiquated these days. So NTLM version 2 is NTLandman version 2. It was used in Windows NT, Service Pack 3 and beyond. It was a replacement for the NTLandman that again had become old and antiquated. The newer version is Kerberos, and Kerberos was actually started in Windows 2000 and is still in use today. It was used in Windows 8 and Windows 2012. Now Windows 10 has moved on to a different system, but up through Windows 8 and Windows 2012, Kerberos was still what is being used, so it's one of the more modern authentication methods. So let's talk about how landman hashes work. Well, essentially you have a password, and it's converted to all uppercases. So let's use the code of let me in. So the password is then padded with null or blanks to make it 14 characters long. So we have let me in 1 and then blank. So we have that string, it's broken up into two sets of 7. So we have let me in and 1 blank 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 blank, and each of those parts is then encrypted separately. We then push those back together with a truncation, and that gives us what our LM hash is going to be. So what is that going to look like in the real world? Well, here's a hash dump of a system. Inside Meterpreter we use the command hash dump. It's part of the Metasploit framework and allows us to collect the remote hashes off that remote system using an interactive shell. Notice here we'll just run the hash dump and we'll be able to get the system key back. So here's what a hash dump looks like. Notice we have the administrator, he's a user 500 account, and then we have his LM hash. We have the guest, he's a 501 account and his LM hashes. Help assistant, support, Bazinga, track, troll, all those user accounts, all of those admin accounts, and you'll see those accounts there with their LM hashes. We can then take that information offline and use something like Orfcrack or John the Ripper to then get the actual password from it. Another way to collect the hashes is using a program called Loafcrack. And Loafcrack is going to be able to extract the hashes from local or remote machines. It also can sniff passwords as they're going across the network. So if I am locally on that network, I can launch Loafcrack and I can start copying those hashes as they're going across the network and then crack them using Loafcrack. Again, this is good if you're in the local network, but if you're doing a remote exploitation, something like Hashdump with Metasploit is going to be more effective for you. Another way of doing this is using a program like pwdump. And pwdump is a command line tool that can bypass the syskey encryption of the SAM, if you have the admin rights already, and it can collect the hashes and store them as a text file. Once you have them as a text file, that hash dump, you can again go through and crack those passwords. So what are some methods of actually cracking a password? Well, one of the ways is dictionary, another way is brute force, and another is hybrid. So what is a dictionary attack? Well, a dictionary attack uses a dictionary or word list to crack a password. And so this is going to be the quickest method of doing it, but it's only as good as the dictionary I have. So let's talk about this. So let's say I have 1,000 words in my dictionary, and I'm trying to crack a password. Well, what ends up happening is I take the first word in the dictionary, I encrypt it, I compare that encrypted hash to the landman hash I had stolen. If they match, I know my password. If not, I move on to the next one and I keep doing it. This can take some actual time. So if I want to do millions and millions of passwords, this will take a long time. So one of the ways we speed that up is we use what's called a rainbow table. And what a rainbow table does is it's actually a dictionary, but it's already pre-hashed. So now I can just compare hash to hash instead of having to create the hash and compare the hash. So that's one way to speed up a dictionary attack as well. Another way to do this is what's called a brute force attack. Now a brute force attack will find the password every single time without fail. The only problem is this can take forever. So what ends up happening is it actually uses random numbers and letters and it will actually start guessing passwords. So if I say I want to check every password up to 8 characters, it's going to start with A, and then it's going to go AA, and then it's going to go AB, AC, AD, and keep going until it gets out to AAA, AAAB, AAC, and it will keep going until it finds it. This can take hours, years, or decades depending on how long and how complex the password is. But it is 100% successful. Now, when I say a long time, there are some times that a brute force attack can take you a billion years. For instance, if you have a 16-character password that's uppercase and lowercase, has special characters and numbers, that is going to take millions of years to crack with a standard computer. So a brute force attack is good if you can kind of give it some parameters. So if I can say, hey, I know the password is going to be between 14 and 16 characters, that can help because I can eliminate having to do all the work up to 14 characters, but again, it's still going to take a long time. Now, one of the ways I can do this better is I can do what's called a hybrid attack. And this is where I take a dictionary list and I can add some things to the beginning or the end of it, or even in between it, to work it a little bit better. And so this takes more time than a dictionary attack, but less time than a brute force attack. So for example, if I thought the password had something to do with password, then I can use things like 1Password, or password123, or password where I replace the A's for ats and the S's for dollar signs. Those type of things are using a hybrid attack. Where is this really helpful? Well, if you did a good job in your reconnaissance phase and you know some information about the person, most people tend to pick passwords that are familiar to them. Dog's name, spouse's name, city they grew up in, high schools, their favorite football team. You start putting those things into your dictionary program. With a hybrid attack, it can start having some good results and be able to find these complex passwords that are based off something the person knows. So what are some of these password cracking tools that are out there? Well, one of the most popular ones out there is called Kane Enable. And what Kane Enable is, it's a multi-purpose tool that performs password cracking, Windows enumeration, and VoIP sniffing. But we're really talking about the password cracking portion here. It can do dictionary attacks, it can do brute force attacks, and it can do those rainbow table attacks. And the nice thing with a rainbow table is that, again, it's going to speed up those dictionaries and become the fastest method out there. Now, what is this picture up here above my head? Well, you'll see on the left side it has length 6, 7, 8, or 9. That's the length of the password. So if I wanted to have every single possible password out there that is up to 6 characters long, that's about 2 gigabytes of text. If I wanted all the way up through 9 characters, that's 60 terabytes of text. And so again, most people, their passwords are up in the 12, 14, 16 characters. You could see how large these text files are and how long it's going to take, even with using a rainbow table, which has pre-encrypted, pre-hashed information. It's still going to be tons and tons of information and will take a long, long time. That's why we say passwords and having strong passwords is by far the most important thing in security. Another one we have out there is John the Ripper. Now, John the Ripper can crack Kerberos, landman hashes, and more. And the passwords that are cracked, though, they're not case sensitive. So if I come back and it cracks it and says it's password, it could be all capital, all lowercase, or a mixture of the two. I don't really know, but at least I've gotten it down into something reasonable. And now the fact that I know that it's 8 characters and it has password as the letters, I can start going through it, and there's only a couple of options and I'll be able to figure it out pretty quickly. Orfcrack is another one that we have out there for password cracking, and this one is really efficient because it uses rainbow tables, so it's very fast. But again, those rainbow tables can be very large. Like I said, if I had up to 9 characters, that means all the passwords between 0 and 9 characters long, every possible combination, there's 60 terabytes of text out there to symbolize that. And so what's one of the ways that we can do this faster? And the one that I'm going to use is CrackStation. So if you go to crackstation.net, it uses rainbow tables for fast password cracking, but the nice thing is it's all done on their servers. So for instance, if I take this landman hash on the screen and I copy it and I paste it into crackstation.net, what will I get? Passphrase floppy. It comes back fairly quickly and you'll be able to find that. Now, if instead I used that doing Orfcrack, it could have taken minutes to hours depending on where it was inside the rainbow table. But by using it at CrackStation and using that cloud computing architecture they have, it can come back much, much quicker for me. So in this lab, we're going to work on escalating privileges. What we're going to do here is we're going to work on stealing passwords and cracking those passwords. Also, we're going to migrate around from processes from a system level to a user level and back. To get started, we need to open up our Metasploit framework. From our Metasploit framework, we're going to use the same exploit we did last time. So we'll just type in use exploit/windows smb ms08_067_natapi. Then we're going to set our payload, and we're going to use the meterpreter payload that we used before, which is windows/meterpreter/reverse TCP. Now at this point we're going to show our options, and you'll notice that we need to set our R host and our L host. So we're going to set our R host for our Windows machine. In my case, the IP for that is .56.100, and then I'm going to set my L host to my Kali machine, which in my case is 56.102. Then I will show my options one more time, and you'll see at this point that I have my Windows machine IP as my R host. We're going to be attacking port 445 with the Nitapi vulnerability. We're going to use our payload of Meterpreter, and we're going to have the callback go back to our Kali machine on port 4444. And now at this point, we're just going to type in exploit. And just like before, we now have an established connection where we've triggered the vulnerability in the Windows XP machine, and it is called back to us with the stage 2, and we have that connection from the Windows machine here to our Kali machine here. So now we're at the Meterpreter prompt. So what do we want to do? Well, the first thing I want to do is I want to know what process I am. So I'm going to type in get PID, and it tells me that I'm process 980. So to understand what that is, I'm going to type in PS, which is going to list all of the running processes on the Windows machine. And here you can see that the running process, expand this just a little bit more for you. So as you can see, process 980 is right here. It's the service host process. And that is actually the system level user, ntauthority/system. So right now we already have system level rights on this machine, so there's no need to escalate our privileges. But if we were a lower level user, we would have to escalate our privileges up. So I'm going to show you some techniques for doing that as well. The reason why we are a system level user in this case is because the exploit we're doing is the service host, and the service host is always run as system. Now, if instead we use something like a spear phishing campaign, we would end up being brought in as that user, who probably doesn't have admin rights, and we'd have to work our way up. And we can still run a lot of the same processes like the hash dumps and password cracking to start from there and migrate upward. So now that we see what process we're in, let's go ahead and see what system ID we do have. So we'll just type in get SID, and you'll notice that it says we are S-1-5-18. Now anything under 500 is going to be a system level type process, whether that's going to be something like the local service or the system itself. Now once we get into users, they start out at 1000 and go above. If you're the administrator, that's a 500 level account. So this last dash number here is going to tell us a lot about what type of process that is and what type of user we are. So now that we're here, let's go ahead and do a hash dump, and we'll see what other users are on the system. So here we go. We have the administrator account. Again, that's that SID 500. We have a guest, which is SID 501. We have the help assistant starts at 1000. The John Sim user is user 1003, and then we have this support account, which is 1002. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy all of this text here, and we're going to put it into a text file, and we're going to save that to our desktop. And to do that, I'm just going to open a terminal here. I'm going to type in gedit, which is a graphical text editor, and we can just paste that in, and then we're going to go ahead and save it to the desktop so we'll know where it is, and we'll just call that hash dump. And at this point we can close that out, and we can close out that one. So now we have a text file with that information, so we can use that in our password cracking. Now before we get to that, I'm going to still play with Meterpreter a little bit more here first and show you some other things. So one of the things I talked about before is that we can do a migration from one process to another, and that should change us into that user. So for instance, right now we are in process 980, which is NT Authority System. Now if I wanted to become John Sim, for instance, the user on this machine, because if I started running things as system like the notepad, that would look suspicious, but if I did it as John Sim, it wouldn't. So I'm going to go ahead and change myself into this one right here, which is process 1248, and that should change me into John Sim, who has a SID of 1003. So what we're going to do is just type in migrate and the PID we want to go to, which in this case is 1248. So migrate to 1248, and you'll see that we're migrating from 980 to 1248. It takes a couple of seconds, and now we should be loaded into that process. It says we're complete. So let's get PID and make sure that we are in the process we wanted. So get PID, we verified we are in 1248, and so now if I do PS, you can see that 1248 is a process owned by John Sim. So let's get our SID and verify that. It should tell us that we're SID 1003 because that's John Sim's SID. And in this case, we do have SID 1003. which is John Sim. So that's how you can migrate from one user to another and one process to another. Now, why else might you want to migrate processes? Well, we'll talk about covering our tracks later, but one of the things we want to do is to cover our tracks is to migrate from processes. And for instance, if we did a vulnerability such as a Internet Explorer exploit, Internet Explorer tends to crash a lot. If the process I'm sitting in crashes, I'm going to lose my access. So if I break in through Internet Explorer, I'm going to want to migrate to something more stable and more hidden, such as the service host account, or the services.exe, or explorer.exe, because they're a lot more stable and they don't crash as often. Now, the other thing to note is why might I want to go to a user that's not system or admin? Like in this case, John Sim's a regular user. Why would I want to migrate into him? Well, one of the reasons why I might want to do that is if I wanted to do key logging. So if I wanted to key log John Sim, I have to be logged in as John Sim. And so in this case, I now am John Sim, so I can start my keylogger and capture those keystrokes. We talked about this before, but I'll go ahead and show that to you now because again, this is another way to escalate our privileges. If John happens to have admin rights and he's on his user account daily and then types in his password to elevate into an admin status, like he installed a new printer or something like that, we'd be able to capture that password. Let me bring up the keylogger commands here again just to remind us. So we'll go up here to help, and we have our key scan start, key scan stop, and again our key scan dump to get those keystrokes. So let's go ahead and start it by doing key scan start. So if I go here and do a key scan start, and now John Sim is on his machine, and let's say he was opening up a notepad and typing in his passwords. Here's my email address and my password of password. And then he decides, you know, that's really not a secure way to save my passwords. I'm going to go ahead and delete those. So he just gets rid of that, never had any evidence. Well, we happen to capture it because we were capturing his keystrokes. And so right here you can see he pressed return, he did password list, hit return, typed in that, hit return, and then password. So why might this be useful? Well, if I had my key scanner going the whole time and I'm capturing all this data, I can capture his side of all conversations, all his instant messages, all his emails, all his usernames and passwords. All of this information is stuff that I can use to elevate my permissions and spread laterally into other systems. So I might now have his usernames and passwords for his banking, his Facebook, his Twitter, all of that stuff because we captured all those keystrokes. It's a pretty cool technique. So now, going back to our escalating privileges, we're still sitting here as John Sim as the user. So the next thing we want to look at is migrating back to system, and we'll go ahead and do that. We'll just do a PS so we can figure out what process we want to go to, and we can go ahead and migrate ourselves into 980 again, just like we were before, and go back to system, and we'll just migrate 980. Again, that's going to move us back, and at this point we should now be the system level user. So we'll do that get PID, we're in 980, get SID, we're back to the system level user, which is that -18. One other thing I'll show you, we're going to go back to John Sim here one more time because I forgot to show this to you. We'll go back to his PID, which was 1248. So now we're back here. You can see that we are user 1003. Again, that's John Sim. Another way to get system is actually using the command get system, and it's part of Meterpreter. And so if you just type in get system, it will go ahead and move and get you system level access. So now if I get my SID, I'm back here as the system level. Now, let's see what process it put us in. We're still in John's process, but we are the system user now. So that's something else that you can look at here. It's an interesting technique, and it works most of the time. Now, the time this won't work is if you are some low-level account that's below a user. So if we look up here in the process list, you'll see that there's this local service account, for instance. This isn't even a user account. This is below user. All it does is local services, and this happens to be for the sound drivers in my system. Now you also have this network services. These processes have such low level access, you can't migrate back into John or back into system because you're too low of a level at that point. The only way to break back into this is actually to exit out of the system and then re-exploit the system. So be careful where you jump into, because if you have system or domain level rights and you go down to a standard user to do something like a keystroke, depending on that user's level of access, you can actually get yourself stuck in that user and you're going to be done at that point. And that's why being able to have their password to be able to log in as them is very important. And that's where our hash dump came in. So if you remembered, we had run the hash dump command, and we got all of these hashes. And so what I ended up doing with them is I put them in this text file. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a program called Johnny. So under Applications, we'll go into Password Attacks and click on Johnny. Now from Johnny, we're going to open a password file, and the file we're going to open is on our desktop, and it's called hashdump. That was the file that we put in the text. Now as we go through, it immediately starts, and it starts going through the attack for us. It's going to try to crack any of the passwords it can find based on the hashes. And so here you see administrator is already cracked as password, and it's working on John Sim. So far it doesn't know what the first part is, but it got the last two letters, which is HO. Now, this is doing a brute force attack, so this can take a long time as it tries to crack things if they're not real words. So in the case of John Sim, this actually says Doctor Who. So the first part of it is going to be doctor with a W at the end. That's not a real word, so it's going to take a long time for it to go through and do its cracking. Now, something that would be a lot quicker is for us to go to something like CrackStation on the internet. And so let's go ahead and I'll show you how that works with John Sim here. So when we created our Kali machine, we didn't allow copy and pasting from Kali back to our desktop environment. So I'm going to have to actually type that in. So it's cdd3ae 5197AA40cc 477A180BA53335E6. And then we're going to go ahead and put in the code over here, which is Diesel Lion is what it looks like, and then crack the hash. And you'll see how quickly it's going to come back with CrackStation. Comes back immediately, and it gives us lots of different choices of what it thinks it could be based on the fact that we have that particular hash. Now, why are there multiple things that it could be based on this hash? So the reason why we have this duplication is there's actually repetition in the hash tables. One of the reasons for that is that LM hashes only support 14 characters. Anything over 14 characters, what it does is it breaks them in half. 7 letters and 7 letters, hashes each part, and then goes again. So in our case, you'll see the fact that we have this Dr. Woodland, Doctor Who web guide, Doctor Who web guide, and if you hash any of these, it comes back to the same hash. Now, what does this tell us? Because now we're like, oh, which one do we choose? Well, if we go back to our Jack the Ripper, if you remember, we ended up having, if we count the letters, DOCTORW. That is the first 7, and notice that all of these first 7 are the same, Dr. W. So that's going to give us the first 7 letters, guaranteed. Well, the nice thing was we had already found the last 2 letters was HO. So we could figure out now it's Dr. WHO, Doctor Who, and then we can use that as the password to get it. There's a little bit of work here required, and again, eventually Johnny is going to go through and crack it all for us, but it hasn't been able to do it yet. Now, there's one more program here that we can use. In fact, there's lots of different programs we can use for password cracking. Another one that's really good is ORFcrack. Now, ORFcrack does require you to have an internet connection so you can download the tables, because if you don't have the tables, it's not really effective. So if you go into this area where table selection is and you click install, you'll be able to install the tables once you download them to your system. But we're going to have to connect the Kali box to the internet first to do that. Now, where do you get those tables from? Well, if you click on help, it'll tell you exactly where to go. You can go to orfcrack.sourceforge.net, and there is a bunch of tables that they have for you, including the XP Free, XP Free Fast, and Vista Free Fast rainbow tables. If you want other tables, they do sell those, but they do have a cost to them. Since we're using XP Machine, we can download the XP Free Small or XP Free Fast to try to do this rainbow cracking on your own and seeing how much more effective it is than doing the methods we just saw. But again, going through CrackStation, all the tables are already loaded, and it's very quick and easy for you to get those passwords. Maintaining access. Hold on tight. So at this point, we've gained our access, we've escalated our privileges, and now we want to maintain access. How are we going to do that? Well, as an attacker, we're going to use a couple of different techniques. One is we're going to have network sniffers, we're going to steal additional passwords, we're going to do lateral movement to other targets, and we're going to open ports and start services. So one of the first things we want to do is we want to survey the host and understand its posture. We want to look for others on the system. Am I really alone here? What if I broke into a system and that target had already had some other attacker on there? Well, I don't want to be fighting with another attacker, so I either want to kick them off and secure the system for myself, or I might want to go look for a different target. Our goal here is we want to keep persistent access. If there's 2 of us on the system, we can actually start tripping each other up, and the system admins can find us quicker. That's not going to be good for us. That's not going to be good for our persistent access. So once we've done this, we maintain our access, we're going to be ready for our data exfil, we're going to be able to do our data compromise, we'll be able to take over the system and do whatever it is for our long-term benefit. But in the meantime, we want to make sure we maintain access. So that target is there when I want it, anytime I want it. So one of the first things we can do is we can use network sniffers. Now, if you're on the same network as the target, you can use Wireshark, and Wireshark is great for this. You turn on Wireshark, you can capture all of the data into a PCAP file, which is network data, and then you can go through it at your leisure and take what you want. Now, if you're not on there and you're doing this remote access, you can use Meterpreter because Meterpreter has a built-in sniffer as well. And so if I attack from my Meterpreter Kali box into a Windows environment or a Linux environment, I can actually use Meterpreter's built-in sniffer to start capturing traffic and download those PCAP files back to myself. So in Meterpreter, how do we do that? Well, if you are from the Meterpreter prompt, you just type in load sniffer and it loads in the sniffer module. And at that point, type in help and you'll get the information about how to use this system. So when we type in help, you'll see something like this. So if you do sniffer start, you'll actually be able to start capturing the network data on the network. If you do sniffer stats, it'll tell you how much has been captured and the statistics currently there. If you do stop and dump, you'll be able to get that data back to yourself. One of the things that we do during this phase is we also want to move laterally. And by moving laterally, we have gotten into a certain target. For instance, we may have attacked a vulnerable web server, as in this picture here. Now I might want to move from there onto a client that's not checked as often so that I can have that persistent access. And so from one system, I can jump from one to another to another to another and work my way around the network. And everywhere I go, I can drop and keep myself persistent access so that I have additional points of presence. The other thing we talked about was getting more passwords. How do we do that? Well, if we're doing network sniffing, we're going to be able to capture more usernames and passwords that way. If we do keystroke logging, we can get more usernames and passwords that way. We can also go, and if we've gotten system or domain level admin, we can start creating additional user accounts for ourselves so that we have them in the future as well. So as we do this lateral movement, we're going to jump from place to place. How do we find places to go? Well, one of the great ways is ARP. And ARP is a way to find potential IPs to go after. One of the things that's provided for us inside Metasploit is an ARP scanner. Again, if we're using the PCAP, in PCAP, we're going to be able to find ARP callouts from machine to machine because machines do this all the time. As I generate this list of IPs, I can use more different techniques, going back again to that enumeration phase and restarting that part as an internal look and see what's going on. There's also scanners like port scanners and TCP scanners built into Meterpreter that you can use, such as the auxiliary scanner, port scan, TCP. But again, as you're getting this network data and you start looking around, you're going to start going through and doing more of that reconnaissance and enumeration again, and we start figuring out where else we can go inside the network. These are the keys to maintaining your access. It's all about more usernames, more passwords, more targets, and moving laterally. If you can do this, you start spreading yourself out and putting hooks in everywhere. It makes it very difficult for the defenders to start clearing you out when they find you. Welcome to the Maintaining Access Lab. Now in this lab we're going to do two things. We're going to learn how to create user accounts and add them into different groups such as the administrator group, and then we're also going to learn how to manipulate the firewall so that we can open up access that we'll be able to get back in at a later time. So to begin this lab, we're going to start with a connection on our Windows XP machine again. We've exploited the same vulnerability, we're back there going through the Netapi service again, and we're now at the Meterpreter prompt. So one of the things I want to do is I want to look at what process I am and what user I am. So again, we're going to do our get PID 980, and now if I type in PS, we can see that 980 is associated with the system user inside the service host process. So what is that if we do the PID and the get SID? The SID is -18 because it's a system level. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to go onto the Windows box and we're going to start creating some accounts in this lab. And so what I want to do is I want to have an administrator's account. The system can create users, but it has a hard time with some of the groups because it's not used to doing that. It's not really what it's made for. Usually you need to be an admin level user. We already know that John Sim is an admin level user. He has those rights. So what we're going to do is migrate into his process and become John Sim. So we can use process 480, which is the Explorer process, and we'll go ahead and migrate there. So we'll migrate into 480, and then we'll verify our SID again by doing get SID. And you can see we are now John Sim the 1003 level user. So that's a good place for us to start. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to shell, which is going to drop us into a Windows command prompt, because everything we're going to do from here on out is standard Windows commands. So what we're going to do from here is we want to actually see what user accounts are on the system. So the first thing I'm going to do is do net user. And when you do that, you'll see the accounts that are created. You'll see here we have the administrator account, the guest account, the help assistant account, John Sim, and 2 support accounts. And what this second support account is one that I have created just to show you an example of how to do that. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to create another one. And so the real support account was actually this one, the 338945. I created one 338945, and you notice there's just 1 digit difference. So we'll do the same type of thing, because it's easy to hide from your system administrator by having these additional accounts. If I put something in there that said hacked or ethical hacker or anything that just looks out of the ordinary, it would be very easy. Now in this particular PC there's very few users, so it'd be very obvious. If you're in a domain environment though, there's hundreds and thousands of users. So you can blend in very easily as long as you use the same naming scheme. So in our case what we're going to do is to create a new account, we're going to type in net user and then the username we want. We'll go ahead and use support, just straight up support. And then we'll give it a password. I'm going to use A1, B2, C3, just to keep things easy as we play. And then /add. When I do that, that account has now been created. We could type in net user and hit enter, and you'll see that account now exists, the support account. Now, what rights does that support account have? Well, that's a great question. Let's go ahead and look at it. The way that we're going to do that is by typing net user and then the username. So net user and then the username, which in our case was support. And you'll see that the support account was created and its password was last set just now. The password is good for 60 days. It does require a password change every 60 days, but it is changeable right now, so we could change our password if we wanted to. Now it can log on to all workstations and it has all login hours. But the only membership it has is a standard user account at this point. So as a standard user account is not going to be very useful for us, we're going to want to get that into the administrator group. So the first thing we want to do is we want to learn what type of groups are on this machine. And so what we're going to do there is we're going to type net local group. So when we type in net local group, you'll see the groups that are on this computer. There's the administrator group, the backup operators group, the guest group, the help services group, the network configuration, power users, remote desktop users, replicator, and users. The only group we're a member of though is the users. We want to be a member of the admin group. So how are we going to do that? Well, we're just going to do net local group, and we're going to see who's in the administrator group first. So we're just going to type in administrators. And you can see right now the only 2 administrators in the system are the administrator and John Sim. Well, we want to be an administrator too, so we can just do net local group, the name of the group, which in our case is administrators, and then we're going to type the username we want to add, which is support, and then /add. And now it tells us that it was successfully added. Now, how do we verify that? Well, we can look in the group membership or we can look at our user. We're going to go ahead and do both just to verify. So net local group, administrators, and you can now see that support has been added to that administrator group. The second thing we're going to do is net user and then support, and we'll see that they now have the ability of being an administrator as well as a user. They're in both groups. Now, this is just a very simple example, but it shows you the power of what you have. Once you've gotten an administrator account, you can start spreading out and creating your own accounts and your own ways back into the system. And that's the way we wanted to show you, is just a simple way of creating additional accounts from the command line. Once you're at this command line, you can do anything that the Windows system will allow you to do from the command prompt. So it's really important to have that Windows System Administrator background, because then you know how to actually operate this system. Now the second part of this lab, we're going to play with manipulating the firewall. So the firewall can actually be manipulated from the command prompt as well. And the way we do that is by using the netsh command. So if we do netsh, this will drop us into the netsh shell. So now that we're at the shell, we want to go into the firewall settings. So we'll type in firewall. So now you'll see our prompt says netsh firewall. So if I type in question, you'll be able to see all of the commands that are available for us. So in the context of our firewall, We can add a firewall configuration, we can delete a firewall configuration, we can dump and display the entire configuration script, we can get help, which is what we did by the question mark, and then we can reset it or set it or show the firewall configuration. So what we're going to do first is we're going to look at the current firewall. So what we're going to do is do show and hit enter. Now, from show, we want to see what the service configuration is. So what services are allowed to run? Right now, they have enabled file and print sharing. So that's good. That's one of the things we use as a way to get back in. Now, what about our port configurations? Let's do show port opening. And so here we can see what open ports we have. We have 139, 445, 137, and 138. What are all those ports used for? That's right, all those ports are used for in the firewall to allow file and print sharing. Since we have file and print sharing enabled, those ports are also available for us to use. In our case, we use 445 as the port that we exploited. That's the one that we came in on. Now, let's see what the logging on our firewall is. So if we do show logging, you'll be able to see that right now drop packets are disabled, we don't log those. Connections are disabled, they don't log those. And where is the location of the log file? It's in the Windows directory. Why is that important to us? Well, in our last step we want to cover our tracks, and so if we've made changes to the firewall, all those are going to get logged. We'll want to go in and clean those out in the log file later on. So what are some examples of things that we can do here? Well, one of the things that the system administrator might have disabled is ICMP or ping traffic echoing, and that way we couldn't footprint the network. Well, one of the ways that we can do now that we're inside the network is we can turn that back on if we wanted to, or if it was on and that was a vulnerability we used to figure out where the network was, we can turn it off. So let's go ahead and turn it on. I'll show you how to do that just so you can get used to using this tool. One of the ways you do that is you type in set ICMP setting 8, which is the echo reply, and then you're going to type in enable. And by doing that, we've now set that setting so that other people should be able to ping it. Now, if we wanted to disable that, we would just do set ICMP setting 8 disable. And again, this goes back to what we talked about before. When you break into the machine, if you want to make sure nobody else can break in because you want to keep that machine to yourself, you might go and actually secure the machine even better than it was before, such as disabling features like this. Now, file and print sharing is already enabled, so we don't have to worry about that, but we could actually disable it at this point. So once we set our back door and we have another way in, we can actually patch the vulnerability that we first exploited, and then we can disable file and print sharing so that other people can't get in as well. We're not going to do that right now because we haven't set our back door yet, so we want to make sure that's still open and available for us. But to do that, what you would do is do set service file and print, and then you do disable. And then you would hit enter, and that would disable the service. We don't want to do that right now because we're going to need it to be able to break back into this box later on. Now, one of the other things you can do is you can just disable the firewall completely. And to do that, you just do set op mode disable. And right now, the entire firewall for that machine is off. And we can verify that by going over to that Windows machine and looking at it. So once we're on that machine, we can just go over here, look at the computer might be at risk, and you'll see now the firewall is off. Now if we enable that, we go back, you'll see the firewall is now on. And that's the type of thing that you can do with this firewall, is you can turn things on and off as needed because you now have control. Normally though, what we're going to do is we're just going to allow specific programs or ports through the firewall. Let's say, for example, I wanted to have a netcat listener sitting on port 5000 on the machine. Well, the way that we would do that is we would have to set an exception in there. So what we can do is set allowed program, whatever the path of the program is, in our case it'd be netcat, and then allow, NC is the name of what we're going to allow, and then enable. Now, we have not set up netcat, we have not uploaded that tool yet, so there's no benefit in us setting this, and it's probably going to error out if we do it. But I just wanted to show you what the command is. Again, we'll play with that more when we start doing our backdoors in a future lesson. Now, what if we just wanted to open up certain ports on the firewall? Well, let's go ahead and look at that again. So again, if we wanted to add something, we would do that with the add command. Now, what are we going to add? In our case, we want to add question mark. I'm going to show you the different things you can add. So here you can see you can add a port or you can add a program. I just showed you the program with the netcat example. Now for a port opening, let's see what the configuration setup is for that. Well, what you have to do is do add port opening, TCP, UDP, or all, the port you want, and then you're going to give it a name, whether it's web port, if it's IKE, if it's DNS, it could be hacker, whatever you want, enable, and then all or custom. So in our case, what we're going to do is we're going to do a add port opening TCP 80, we'll call it www, and then we'll enable it for all. So what we'll do is add port opening TCP port 80, we'll call it www as if they were running a web server, and then we're going to enable all. Now it says it's good. How do we verify it's good? Well, we can do that from the command prompt, or again we can look on the machine and see what it's going to look like to the victim. What we're going to do here is we're going to look at it from the command prompt. So what we're going to do is we're going to do show, and then we want to show the port openings. And if you remember correctly, we had 4 ports before that were all associated with file and print services. Now we should see port 80 added to that list. And so you see that port 80 is open. Now we can verify that on the victim side. What will that look like to them? Well, for them to see that, they're going to actually go in to their firewall, and they're going to actually have to look at the configuration and the setup for it. Now, where do you get to the firewall on a Windows XP machine? You just scroll down and click on Windows Firewall. Then from here we go to exceptions, and you'll see there's now this exception for www. And if we edit it, we can see TCP port 80. That's what they actually did. And so you can see that from the victim perspective, they're not going to see anything unless they really are checking their firewall all the time and looking at it. In this case, they're not, and so they don't see it. So those are just some basics of how to use the firewall and set it up. The nice thing about it is that you can do everything from the command line, but you've got to get used to the way the command prompt works. You have to get used to the way the NetSH firewall tool works. There's lots of things you can do once you have the exploitation in the machine. It's just a matter of determining what your intent is and what it is you want to accomplish. Covering your tracks and installing backdoors, also known as digging in deep. So at this point, we've performed our reconnaissance, we've scanned and enumerated, we've gained our access, we've escalated our privileges, we've maintained our access and moved laterally, and now we want to make sure that we're in here for the long haul. How do we make sure we don't get caught? This is where we have to cover our tracks and place some backdoors. So what does that really mean? Well, covering our tracks and installing backdoors means we're going to erase the evidence. We're going to modify the evidence. We're going to disable logging. We can clear log files. We can hide files and folders. We can install rootkits and backdoors, and we can even set up callback times so the machines call us back at certain times of the day instead of maintaining a persistent connection all of the time. These are all different ways for us to cover our tracks. So let's talk about erasing the evidence. The first thing you want to do is you want to erase any temporary files. These would include log files or any droppers that you've put on the system. So if I've put on a stage 1 malware, then I want to delete it because now that I've got stage 2, I don't need stage 1 anymore. If I went into the Windows temporary directory and that's where I've been putting my log files and gathering my information at, I want to download that information and then delete those files. Anything that I have on the system could be found by a system administrator, so I want to clean up as much as possible. Modifying the evidence. So when I modify the evidence, I'm going to change the contents of the log files. So I might go into a log file and change it so that my IP is not the one that's being shown. So the other thing you have to worry about is the time on the files. So if I have a log file and I've edited that IP right now, then the time modifier is going to show up as right now, not the last time the system administrator used it. So what I can use is the program timestamp as part of Meterpreter to actually change that last access time to a time in the past so that it won't look suspicious that I did this today. Again, anything I can do to throw those system administrators off is going to be better for me as the attacker. The other thing I want to do is I can change user identities. Instead, I want to change that. Instead of saying user Jason has done this, I want it to say user Bob has done this. Any of those things that can throw the system administrators off my scent is always a good thing for me. So how do you use timestamp? Well, there's a couple of different ways. I talked about the fact that Meterpreter has a built-in tool for this, but if you're using Linux, Unix, or OS X, there's also 2 other ways you can do this. One is you can use touch. And what touch does is actually updates the time to the current time. This is not as useful as using something like timestamp because it's going to make it as if we modified it right this second, which may not be the most covert thing for us to be doing. The other thing we can do is use ctime, which changes the time to a given date and time. This is a lot more useful and is essentially what we're doing with timestamp inside of Meterpreter. So I can go back and say, hey, the last time this file was accessed was 2.5 weeks ago at 1:38 p.m. That's what ctime allows you to do. Another thing you can do is you can actually turn off logging. So let's say I broke into the system right now. One of the first things I might want to do is disable logging, go do all my exploitation, and then re-enable logging. That way, I don't have to go and clean up 300 different things that I did. I only have to clean off the initial getting on the system and the initial getting off the system. Audit poll is a command line tool from the NT resource kit. This is how you can actually disable logging inside of Windows. One of the other ways that we can do things is we can clear off those log files. Now, WinZapper, Evidence Eliminator, LSlave, these will all erase log files. If you're in Linux, a lot of those log files are text-based files, so you can actually just delete those files. Now the problem is, while this does cover your tracks and they won't be able to track it back to you, it is very obvious because system administrators are used to looking at log files. And if they go to the log files and there is no log file, they're going to know they've been had. And so this is something you only want to do if you run out of time and you can't modify those log files. That's when you would go and clear the entire log files. Now, the other thing here is that as an ethical hacker, we have no use to do this. There's no reason that we would ever clear the log files because we're going to cover up bad guys as well as ourselves if we do this. So in an ethical hacking event, you will not be clearing your log files. You may modify them, but you will never clear them. So, while I'm on the system, what are some other ways I can hide myself? Well, besides disabling log files and deleting log files and modifying log files, I can also hide files and folders. So, if I'm using a Linux or a Unix system, hidden files are going to start with a dot. If you're using Windows, we can do things like an alternate data stream. And we'll go through this in a lab environment to show you how easy it is to do an alternate data stream as well. Another way you can do this is you can use hidden attributes. So in Windows, you do the +H, that's going to show it as a hidden file. You can also put files into low traffic areas. How often do people go and look at the C:/Windows/System32 folder? Probably not very often, so we can hide some stuff in there if we wanted to. The other thing you can do is you can hide things in slack space. Slack space is not directly accessible by the operating system, but there's tools that you can use to go and use that empty space on the hard drive and put files there that are then accessible to you and not to the general public. Alternate data streams. So alternate data streams provide a method to hide malware on an NTFS file system. So these streams are almost completely hidden. The file size won't really increase that much, and you'll be able to hide files inside other files. And the way you do this is you're going to do type the file you want to hide, a right caret, the file you want to hide it in, colon, and the file you were hiding. So, for example, if I was hiding Notepad inside of calc, I would do type notepad.exe, right caret, calc.exe, colon, notepad.exe. Now when I want to run it, I'm just going to do start calc.exe, colon, notepad.exe. Again, I'm running that hidden file, notepad, which is hidden inside of calc. Now what does that look like on a real system? Well, if you notice here on the top, I have calc.exe as a 91K file. 408 bytes is actually how large it is. Now I'm going to hide notepad inside of calc. Did it make it go any larger? No, it's still 408 bytes. So for all intents and purposes, you can't see the fact that I have Notepad inside of calc in the bottom part of the screen. But it is there, and if I type start calc.exe colon notepad.exe, it will launch the Notepad program for us. So we talked about hiding in the slack space. In Linux, we have a program called bmap, and we can use that to hide files in the slack space. What exactly is the slack space? Well, when you put in a file on a hard drive is actually divided into sectors, and there's sometimes extra space. We call that the slack space. So when the file ends, for instance in the picture here, I have 6.5 parts out of 8 are taken up by that green file. That left about 1.5 of orange that is empty. Now that empty space can actually be used and hide files in there. The file system won't read it, they won't realize it's there, but I'll know it's there as the attacker, and I can actually go in and put my files in there and use that extra empty space. It's a great place to hide. It makes it very hard for people to find your stuff. Another way we can hide is by installing rootkits and backdoors. Now, what is a rootkit? Rootkits were originally only on Linux, but now they're on Windows too. Some good examples are FU, Vanquish, Hacker Defender, AFX. And what rootkits are is they will actually bind into the operating system themselves and hide themselves so that it can actually take over some of the commands. So when a system administrator is giving commands, it's actually giving commands where it thinks to the operating system, but it's not. It's giving it to the rootkit, who then gives them back false information. This allows us to hide and keep ourselves hidden longer. Another thing we can do is we can set up backdoors. And again, like I talked about before, those backdoors can be things like callouts, and we can do that with scheduling and timing. So for Windows, how do we do that? We can use SC, which is managing our services. We can start and stop services that would start and stop our malware. We can use NetSH, which will modify our Windows firewall, opening up ports. And then we can use AT, which is a automatic time scheduler. It will schedule programs to run at certain times. So maybe every morning at 2 a.m. I want the Windows system to go and do a ping back to my host. That tells me that that Windows system is still under my control and available for me if I need it. That could be something like a beacon. And that's one of the ways that I can use that, is so that I can know, hey, all the systems will call back to me at 2 a.m. I get one ping from them every 24 hours. I know they're still mine. And then, if that doesn't come back, I know that either the machine is off or that the defenders have found me and cleared my malware. Now on Linux and Unix and OS X, we use things like cron jobs. Cron tab will set up tasks to run in the future. This is like the AT command we had in Windows. And AT also works in Linux and Unix, so you can schedule programs to run at certain times, just like we did in Windows. Again, that's that automated time setup for the future. You can have it do anything you want. I've set up some AT jobs on people where at 3 in the morning it will actually start playing music for them. And the reason why we do that is it can be used like an alarm clock, or again as one of those prank things, or one of those ways to show system administrators, hey, I got you, you didn't find me, it's been 3 weeks, so now I'm going to set off a music at 3 in the morning so you'll know that I'm there. So there's lots of different ways that we can cover our tracks, and we can place backdoors as we go through our systems. These are just a small, quick summary of some of the minor ones. Now that we've talked about some of the ways we can cover our tracks and place backdoors, we're going to go into our lab environment and we're going to play with both the alternate data streams and the time scheduling. So in this lab, we're going to go and do a couple of techniques to cover your tracks and also to set up callbacks for those backdoors. So again, the first thing we're going to do is exploit the Windows machine to get back on the box. Now that I'm there, again, I'm going to check my SID. I am sitting there as a system level user. Again, I want to switch over to a normal admin user. And in our case, we're going to go ahead and switch back into John Sim at this point because we haven't set up a remote desktop connection to allow us to use that new support account that we've created. So what we're going to do is we're just going to go ahead and migrate into process 480, which is the Explorer, and that will give us rights as if we are John Sim. And we'll do the get SID again and verify that we are John Sim. Now, again, everything I'm going to do here is going to be from the Windows prompt, so we're going to go ahead and type in shell, and now we're back on that box as if we are John Sim. Now, the first thing I want to show you is how to set up a callback. So in the last lesson, we showed how to open up a port on the firewall, but how do we get the machine to always start up that netcat listener for us so that it can call back to us whenever we want, or that we can call back to it whenever we want? Well, the way you do that is by using the at command, and at is just an automatic time scheduler. So the way at works is we can set up any program to run whenever we want. And we can do that based on every day, every week, every month, or a specific day of the week at a certain time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up an at command, and first I'm going to check the time on the local system, because if I don't understand the time, everything's going to be messed up, because I bet you the Windows machine is not showing 9:51 like my Kali machine is. So let's type in time, and you'll see that for them it is 4 o'clock in the afternoon, 16:53. So what I'm going to do is we're going to set up a time to do something, and the time we're going to do it is going to be 4 o'clock and 57 minutes. That'll give us a couple of minutes to be ready and be there. So what we're going to do is type in at and the time we want it to happen. So in our case it'll be 16:57, and we're going to tell it to do it every Sunday. And then we're going to give it the command we want. Now what I'm going to do, because I haven't set up a listener yet, is I'm just going to use something simple. I'm going to have it bring up a command prompt, and in the command prompt I'm going to have it run a system info command and pipe that to a file called info.txt in the C drive. That'll work just fine for us. We could type in enter, and there's now a new job. To show the job, we can just type in at, and you'll see that each Sunday at 4:57, that is what's going to happen. Now, what will we see on the victim machine? Well, we're going to go over to that box and we're going to see what the victim's going to see at 457. So I want to show you what we're going to see. Right now there's nothing in the C drive as far as a file, and it is 456. Now at 457, it's going to run the command and basically just do a system info, which is a very quick command, and dump all that information to a text file. And we should see a text file be created on our C drive. Now that particular command takes a little bit to run, so while it runs it takes a minute or two. You can see now that we've finished and we have the info file and it has some data in it. So if we open it up, you can see all the information that you would get from a system info command. Now that's not necessarily very useful to us, but it does give us something, and it shows us the capability of being able to run any program we want. And again, if you open that firewall, it can be doing things like pinging back to you and telling you, hey, I'm still awake and I'm under your control, or it can call you back so that every Thursday at 3 a.m. there's that call back to you and your machine can answer it, and then you can exploit that machine. So maybe you've set up maybe you've set up password sniffers, maybe you set up network sniffers, maybe you set up keyloggers, and every week you need to go back and get those files. It can set up that connection and send those back to you. It all depends on what you want to do and what program you want it to run. And that's just a little bit of how you can use @ as a way to create that backdoor and help set up ways to send things back to you as you need. Now, let's talk about how we're going to hide some information. Well, we have this info file, so we'll use that as our information file. And you have this hacked file. Now I'm going to do this on John Sim's machine. You can do this from the command prompt on the interpreter box as well, but we're going to use it over here so you can see what the effect is of us doing this. So first I'm going to open up a command prompt, and what we're going to do is we're going to use what's called an alternate data stream, an ADS. And we talked about this in the lecture, but now we're going to use it in practice. So let's say I wanted to hide this info file inside this hacked file on the desktop. Now instead of this being the hacked file, maybe this is the person's Word document or something like that. Alternate data streams will work any type of file you want, executable or not. So what we're going to do here is we're going to get to the root directory first. So we're going to go to the C drive, and from the C drive we can see that info file. Now on the desktop we have the hack file. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and move into the John Sim desktop. And from the desktop, you can see he has one file called hacked, and it is 37 bytes. Very small file. So what am I going to do? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to type the c:/info.txt, which is my info file, and that's the one I want to hide. So in my case, it could be malware or anything else. In our case, we're just going to hide text inside other text. And we're going to hide that inside the file that we have here on the desktop, which is the hacked file. And the way we do that is type hack.txt : and then the name of the file, in our case info. And it's done. So let's see how large that file is. It's still 37 bytes. And can I still open the hacked file? Yes, it still looks the same. How do I get that info file out? Well, the way we're going to do that, we're going to read it. Let me delete that so I'll show you that it's no longer there. Well, if I just type to the screen hack.txt, you'll see that's all I have is that one line. Now if I open it using Notepad, well, if I open it, I can do notepad hack.txt, it opens up and I get the hacked file. Now, if instead I want the info file, I have to do start and then do notepad, then do hack.txt : info.txt and hit enter. And what do you see? The information that we hid. Now, is that information still in the original file? No, because we deleted it, right? And you can see here that file doesn't exist. So there's really no hint that I've hidden a file inside this hacked file. If I open it as the user, I just see the normal file. I don't see the hidden information. That's what an alternate data stream allows you to do. It just hides it. And even from the operating system, again, you see that that file size has not changed. It's still 37 bytes. Now, in reality, it's larger, but that data is hidden inside this alternate data stream. And this is a function of the way NTFS file systems work. Now, why is this useful to us? Well, instead of hiding text, I could be hiding malware. And then I can call that malware using the AT program. So I can actually hide things very cleverly inside the file system. No one's going to ever see them because they're that alternate data stream. But then I can actually start them using the AT command every night at midnight or every night at 3 a.m. And that malware will make that call back to me. This is how attackers maintain their access. They dig in, they hide, and they cover their tracks. And that's what we're doing with the @command and the alternate data streams. In this course, you've learned some of the basic techniques and methods used by cyber attackers. At this point, we've covered many different techniques throughout the course and throughout all 6 phases of a hack. We've combed the web to gather open source information in social media and other sources during our reconnaissance phase. Then we scanned and enumerated the network using Central Ops and ZenMap. Next, we gained access to our victim using the Metasploit framework and well-known vulnerabilities that we identified during that enumeration phase. Once on the victim machine, we escalated our privileges using process migration, password cracking, and hash dumps. We then maintained our access by manipulating the firewall and creating additional user accounts and giving those accounts administrator rights. Finally, we covered our tracks using alternate data streams to hide the information in tools and used automated scheduling to create callbacks and backdoors. I hope that this was an eye-opening experience for you into the world of hacking and a cyber attack, and I hope it gives you a great introduction into the hacker's mindset. At the end of this course, I hope I've only left you with one question, and that's, what should I learn next to continue my hacking adventure? Congratulations on completing this course. I hope you've enjoyed our last few hours together, and I assume you did, because otherwise you probably wouldn't have made it this far. Now, as my way of saying thank you for sticking with me throughout this entire course, this video has a few special offers and deals just for people like you who got through the entire thing. Now, as you may know, I have a lot of different courses here on Udemy. We have courses on the CompTIA A+, Network Plus, Security Plus, CISA Plus, and Pentest Plus exams, as well as the Linux Professional Institute's Linux Essentials, ITIL 4, Prince 2, and Prince 2 Agile certifications, and we are adding more all of the time. In addition to all of these certification courses, though, we also have continuing education courses focused on cybersecurity, information technology service management, and project management. To see a complete list of all of our Udemy courses and to get them for the lowest price point possible, just go to deontraining.com/Udemy for a special discount link to each of our courses for our current Udemy students. Udemy is changing their prices all of the time based on current demand and many other factors. But if you use the links on our website at deontraining.com/Udemy, you're always going to receive our best price for any of our courses using our special instructor link coupons. Now, we update these links all of the time to ensure you're always getting the best possible price. Now, speaking of deontraining.com, you may notice we also offer courses over there. So, what's the difference between our Udemy courses and the courses on deontraining.com? Well, the courses on our website contain everything you need for a single certification. For example, if you're getting your ITIL or Prince 2 course over at deontraining.com, not only will you get all the videos from the Udemy version, you'll also get the study guide, all the quizzes, and all of the practice exams in both versions of the Udemy course. In addition to this on our site, you also are going to get your exam voucher to take the official certification exam. Now, if you're going to buy one of our courses at deontraining.com, I recommend using the coupon code Udemy because this is going to give you a special discounted price just for our Udemy students. Now, if you're buying a CompTIA course on deontraining.com, you're going to get all of your videos, the quizzes, and all of the practice exams, as well as our study guide, just like you would on Udemy. But the big difference over on our site is you also get access to our integrated, hands-on labs for each of our CompTIA certification courses. These labs are truly exceptional, and they provide you with about 40 hours of extra guided training to ensure that you're ready not just for the certification exam, but also to perform the job functions of an IT or cybersecurity technician out in the field. If you want to go deeper than just passing the test, these courses are your ticket to becoming a proficient technician or administrator. When you're buying one, remember to use the coupon code Udemy when you're purchasing them because this will give you a special discounted price, again, just for our Udemy students. So once again, I want to say thank you for spending the last few hours with me, and I hope to see you in your next course as you go upward in your career. Remember, you can always connect with me on Facebook at facebook.com/groups/deontraining or at deontraining.com. Until next time, keep on studying and let's get you certified.
Your networks are facing a constant barrage of attacks by malicious actors, hackers, hacktivists, script kiddies, advanced persistent threats, and even nation-states are all searching for footholds into networks around the globe. System administrators have always been the first line of defense in system security, and in this global cyber war, your role has become increasingly important to the security of our networks. As a linchpin to network defense, it is imperative that system administrators understand the vulnerabilities and methodology employed by malicious cyber actors in order to assist in stopping cyber attacks. In the anatomy of a cyber attack, you will learn to dissect the techniques used by hackers in their exploitation of a network, from open source research and reconnaissance to the exploitation and covering of their tracks. You will learn hands-on techniques to probe your network for vulnerabilities and understand how they are exploited. Taught by an expert in cybersecurity, you will learn to think like a hacker in order to thwart their future attacks on your networks. The anatomy of a cyber attack is essential to understanding the landscape of today's cyber threats. A truly eye-opening experience into the world of cybersecurity.
So I've had a lot of students ask in the Q&A, you showed us some techniques that work on Windows XP, but will these same techniques work in Windows 7 or above? Well, yes they will. Now, the particular exploit that we used, the Microsoft 08 TAC 067 Netapi vulnerability, was very specifically geared towards Windows XP and Windows 2003, and it would work on some Windows 7 systems if they weren't patched against that vulnerability. Now, that particular example, there isn't a whole lot like that when you start getting into the newer operating systems like 7, 8, and 10, because Microsoft has done a much better job of patching those type of vulnerabilities. Most of the exploits you're going to find inside Windows 7, 8, and 10 are going to be things that require some degree of social engineering, whether that is something that requires a user to click on a link to go to a particular website, to open a particular file that has viruses or trojans embedded that might give you some access, or anything else of that nature. Now, there was one that was recently released a couple of weeks ago that is referred to as the EternalBlue. So EternalBlue came from a leak of documents and tool sets that this hacking group called Shadowbroker had found. And part of those leaks, somebody had taken the code and there's an SMB vulnerability, very similar to what we did in the Windows XP stuff, and they actually turned that into a ransomware called WannaCry that has really made headlines. Well, this particular vulnerability that we're going to use is actually called Microsoft 17 TAC 010 EternalBlue. And we're going to use that here on a Windows 7 machine. Now, Metasploit does have the ability to do this. You have to download the latest version of Metasploit by updating it. And if you're not sure how to do that, just Google how to update my Metasploit, and you'll be able to connect your Metasploit terminal to the internet and download those latest patches. This one actually came out only 4 days ago, and so this is May of 2017 when I'm filming this, and this is a brand new exploit that we're going to be using. Now, when we go into the next video, I'm going to show you step by step how this is going to work, how we're going to set this up inside Kali Linux. It's going to look very similar to what we did with our Windows XP stuff, except that we're going to be attacking a Windows 7, and the ones that are vulnerable are Windows 7 and Windows 2008 server, and they have to be 64-bit version. There is a version of this that people are in development for Windows 8 and Windows 10, but they're not released just yet. But again, these same techniques work all the time. If you just start doing some Googling, you'll figure out what are the latest exploits and what the newest things are out there. I'll see you in the lab in the next video. Welcome to the lab. So in this one I have two machines. I have a Windows 7 64-bit operating system, and I'm going to have a Kali Linux machine that we've been using all the time. Now, my particular Kali Linux machine has been updated to the latest patches and the latest exploits, including the one we're going to use today, which is called EternalBlue, because it was released just 4 days ago. Now, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go on our Kali Linux machine, just like we did before, and we're going to go ahead and find out what our IP address is by using ifconfig. Now, you'll see here that when we use ifconfig, our IP address, or my IP address, is 192.168.56.102. Now, that tells me that since its subnet mask is 255.255.255.0, that this is a /24 network. So I'm going to open up ZenMap, and I'm going to go do a search across this network. That way I can find the Windows machine that is on this network, and so I'll know where it is. Now, if you've done your reconnaissance already and you know the IP address, you can scan just for that one IP. So as ZenMap goes, I'm going to fast forward here so we don't have to sit here watching it as it's churning away on its scans. When it's done, you're going to see the fact that it found the Windows 7 machine, and it did find 3 ports open. It found 135, 139, and 445. Now for EternalBlue, it does require port 445 to be open. And so that means that Windows 7 machine has to have file sharing enabled. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to get to it with this exploit. So now that it's done finding it, we're going to click on that Windows machine. Again, you're going to see that this is a Windows machine. It thinks it's a Windows Server 2008. That's okay. Windows 7 and Windows Server 2008 share a very common code base. But when I look at the ports and hosts, the way that it responded on 445, it tells me this is a Windows 7 machine. So I'm going to open up my Metasploit framework using MSF console, just like we did in the previous labs. Now, once Metasploit framework is loaded, what we're going to do is we're going to use the command use and then the exploit exploit/windows/smb/ms17_010_EternalBlue, and then we're going to hit enter. Now we're going to show our options, and you'll see here that the only option that we have to do is set our remote host. So I'm going to set our host as 192.168.56.101, the Windows 7 machine, and then I'm going to type run. Now from here, it's going to go and do its exploit. We're using a standard shell response, not interpreter payload, although we could have set that as well. So then I get back C:\Windows/System32, and I'm going to go ahead and change myself to the root directory. Now notice on my Windows 7 machine there was no folder there. Now I'm going to do make directory, you've been hacked. And when I do that, boom, it's on the Windows 7 machine instantly, because I have root access to do whatever I want on this Windows machine. So now I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to go into that directory and I'm going to create a file and leave a message to the person, because again, if I'm doing a penetration test, I want to let them know how I got in and why I got in. And so I'm going to do a quick echo command, and here I'm just going to say this works on Windows 7 and Windows 2008 servers, and I'll put that into a file that is going to be called hack.txt or work.txt. And now you'll see work.txt popped up in the Windows 7 machine. So at this point, I can do whatever I want on this Windows machine. I can move files, I can remove files, I can delete files, I can create new files, I can grab system information, I can create users, pop holes in the firewall, and really just start expanding my access from here. This was just the initial way in. Now again, this is only going to work on Windows 7 and Windows 2008 right now. There are people who are working on Windows 8 and Windows 10 exploits for this particular vulnerability as well. Microsoft has released a patch, but people are not patching quick enough on this one, so it's really been getting out of hand. Now, the good thing is that a lot of people are starting to take notice because of the WannaCry ransomware, and they don't want their files to get hacked, so they have been updating their software. So your services and your systems in your companies are probably going to be okay from this one, but it is one you want to scan and you want to look for as you're going through your penetration test. And this is just a simple example that these techniques that we went through in this class, they are timeless. It is the same stuff we've been doing for the last decade or two. The only difference is the particular exploit that we use. And as you go through and use a vulnerability scanner like Nessus or any of the other products out there, OpenVAS, you can start learning which things are vulnerable on which networks and start getting a better repertoire and be able to start attacking those things as you move forward. I hope you guys enjoyed this bonus lecture as I updated this course just a little bit and really show you some of the latest techniques and what was being used in WannaCry to be able to get this ransomware out there.